Welcome to my channel where we decode mysteries and take you on gentle, thought-provoking journeys to help you drift off to a peaceful sleep. Wishing you a good night's sleep tonight. Ethan Hayes wasn't the kind of person to believe in conspiracy theories. He'd heard all the talk, the whispers in coffee shops, the late-night TV rants, even the podcasts his friends swore by. But he brushed it off as nothing more than overactive imaginations. Life was messy, random. That's what he believed. So when his flight was unexpectedly rerouted through Denver International Airport, he wasn't expecting anything other than a routine layover. The airport had long been a source of fascination for conspiracy theorists, but Ethan never paid much attention to the rumors. Murals with hidden messages, strange architecture, underground tunnels leading who knew where. It all sounded like something out of a movie. Yet, as his cab pulled up to the massive structure, something about the place gave him pause. The blue Mustang statue outside the airport was the first thing he noticed. Towering over the entrance, its glowing red eyes pierced through the dusk like a warning. The locals had nicknamed it Blucifer, a fitting moniker considering its menacing appearance. Ethan had seen pictures of it before, but standing in its shadow felt different, unnerving. There was an unsettling energy about it, a heaviness in the air that made him grip his suitcase a little tighter. He shook it off, telling himself it was just tiredness. After all, it had been a long day of delayed flights and last-minute changes, but as he stared up at the towering structure, its peaks resembling snow-covered mountains, a sense of disquiet crept over him. The design was striking, but also surreal. Ethan couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something about the place felt deliberate. Inside, the airport buzzed with activity. Travelers hurried from gate to gate, their footsteps echoing off the vast walls of the terminal. Ethan checked his watch. 2 hours until his next flight, plenty of time to grab a coffee and stretch his legs. But as he wandered through the expansive halls, his curiosity began to get the better of him. The murals were the first thing that caught his eye. Bright, sprawling works of art that covered entire walls. The vivid colors and chaotic imagery stopped him in his tracks. One mural depicted scenes of destruction, fires raging, soldiers in gas masks, children crying beneath a dark sky. Yet just a few feet away, another mural offered hope. Rainbows arching over smiling faces, hands reaching out in unity. The juxtaposition was jarring. What kind of message was the airport trying to send? Ethan approached one of the murals, tilting his head as he studied the details. Amid the chaos of the scene, there were symbols tucked away in the background, patterns in the clouds, shapes carved into the mountains. Even the way the figures' shadows fell on the ground seemed too precise to be random. It was as if the artist had hidden a code in plain sight, daring someone to unravel its meaning. "Strange, isn't it?" a voice said from behind him. Ethan turned to see an older man in a janitor's uniform. The man's face was weathered, his eyes sharp, despite the smile he wore. He held a mop in one hand, the other casually resting on the handle of his cart. "What's that?" Ethan asked, pointing to the mural. "The murals," the man said, nodding toward the wall. "People think they're just art, but they're more than that. Messages. Some say warnings, even." Ethan chuckled nervously. "Warnings about what?" The janitor shrugged, but his gaze didn't waver. "Depends on who you ask. Some say they're about the end of the world. Others think they're clues to something bigger. Something hidden beneath the surface." "Hidden beneath the surface?" Ethan repeated, raising an eyebrow. The janitor leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "This place has secrets, kid. You ever hear about the underground tunnels? They go on for miles, deeper than you'd think. Some say they're for storage, others say they're bunkers, and some think..." He paused, glancing around before continuing. "Well, let's just say there's more to this airport than meets the eye." Ethan stared at the man, unsure whether he was serious or just trying to mess with him. But there was something in the janitor's tone. something in his eyes that made him hesitate. Before he could respond, the man straightened up and pushed his cart down the hallway, whistling a tune that echoed through the cavernous space. Shaking his head, Ethan told himself it was just a bit of local lore. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that the man had left him with. As he continued walking, he noticed other oddities, things he hadn't picked up on before. The strange gargoyle sculptures perched near the baggage claim, the way certain hallways seemed to curve subtly, almost imperceptibly, as if guiding him somewhere he didn't intend to go. And then there were the symbols. They were everywhere, etched into the floor tiles, carved into the walls, even woven into the patterns of the carpeting. They weren't immediately noticeable, but once he started looking, he couldn't stop seeing them. Some were geometric, others more abstract, but they all seemed to share a common language, one Ethan didn't understand but couldn't ignore. With over an hour left before his flight, Ethan found himself wandering deeper into the airport, drawn by a mix of curiosity and unease. The main terminal, with its bustling crowds and the steady hum of announcements, faded into the background as he moved into a quieter section. The lighting seemed dimmer here, the polished floors giving way to scuffed tiles that reflected the occasional flicker of a fluorescent bulb. The further he walked, the more the energy of the place shifted. It wasn't just the physical quiet, it was an oppressive stillness, the kind that crawled under his skin and made his instincts prick with unease. At first he tried to dismiss the feeling, attributing it to nothing more than nerves. He had always been a bit anxious in unfamiliar places, and Denver International Airport was massive, its labyrinthine layout disorienting even for frequent travelers. But as he passed row after row of empty seating areas and darkened kiosks, the sensation grew stronger. It wasn't just that the crowds had thinned out, it was as though this section of the airport had been entirely forgotten. The usual comforting backdrop of distant conversation, rolling suitcases and footsteps was gone, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed against his ears. That's when he saw it. At the end of a dimly lit corridor, tucked between two maintenance doors, was another door, unmarked and slightly ajar. The fluorescent light above it buzzed faintly, casting a pale glow that seemed to draw his eyes like a beacon. Something about the door felt inherently wrong. It didn't belong here, out in the open yet somehow hidden, as though it were waiting for someone to notice it. Ethan stopped a few feet away, his heart pounding in his chest. He hesitated, his logical mind urging him to turn back. This wasn't his business, and it was probably just a service area or a restricted zone. But something about the door gnawed at him, a whisper of a challenge that tugged at his curiosity. His eyes darted to the corners of the hallway. There were no security cameras, no signs warning him to keep out, and no staff nearby. The area was so still, so utterly devoid of life, that it felt almost unreal. Ethan stepped closer, his sneakers squeaking softly against the tiles. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. Beyond it was a narrow stairwell, the kind you might find in a service area or a building's emergency exit. The air here was different, cooler, almost damp, with a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of his throat. The fluorescent light at the top of the stairs flickered intermittently, casting uneven shadows that danced along the walls. As his footsteps echoed against the concrete, Ethan's unease deepened. Every step felt heavier than the last, his breathing shallow as the dim light at the top of the stairs faded further into the distance. He could hear the faint hum of machinery, a low vibration that seemed to emanate from the very walls, thrumming in his chest like a heartbeat. It was hypnotic in a way, pulling him forward, even as every rational part of him screamed to turn back. At the bottom of the stairs, Ethan found himself in a long, sterile hallway. The walls were stark, made of plain concrete and steel, lined with doors that bore no signs or labels. The air was still cooler down here, and the faint hum he'd heard earlier was louder now, a steady thrum that felt alive somehow. Ethan glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something behind him, but the stairwell was empty. The door at the top now a distant memory. He wasn't sure why he kept going. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, each identical section blending into the next. The dim lighting flickered sporadically, creating brief flashes of clarity before plunging everything back into an unsettling gloom. Ethan's footsteps sounded unnaturally loud in the confined space, the echo amplifying with every step. Each time he passed another unmarked door, his curiosity grew sharper, mingling with a growing sense of dread. Finally, he reached a door that stood out from the rest. It was heavier than the others, its surface marked with intricate symbols etched deeply into the metal. The patterns were strange, almost geometric, and looked disturbingly familiar. His hand hovered over the handle. His mind raced. He pressed his ear to the cold surface and froze. There were voices on the other side, muffled but distinct. They spoke in low, deliberate tones, the cadence too purposeful to be casual conversation. Ethan couldn't make out the words, but there was an undeniable intensity in their tone, a weight that made him hesitate. Every instinct screamed at him to walk away, to turn around and pretend he had never seen this door. But his curiosity had already taken hold, and the pull of whatever lay beyond was too strong to resist. With a deep breath, Ethan gripped the handle and turned it. The door was surprisingly smooth, opening with a soft hiss as it swung inward. A dim, sterile light flooded out, bathing the hallway in its glow. What he saw inside froze him in place. His breath caught in his throat. The room was enormous, far larger than he had expected, and filled with rows of monitors mounted on every wall. Each screen displayed something different: maps, blueprints, live surveillance feeds, and lines of coded data scrolling too fast to read. The air was filled with a faint hum, punctuated by the occasional beep of unseen machinery. In the center of the room stood a massive circular table. Its surface was covered in documents, schematics, and objects Ethan couldn't immediately identify. And then he saw them, a group of people standing around the table. Their figures were obscured by the dim light, but their presence was unmistakable. They were dressed in dark suits, their movements deliberate, their posture commanding. They spoke to each other in hushed tones, their faces partially turned away. At the head of the table stood a woman. Her silhouette was sharp and defined. Her hand rested on a thick file marked with the same symbols that adorned the door. Her stance radiated authority. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as he tried to process what he was seeing. This wasn't just a hidden room. It was something bigger, something he wasn't meant to find. Before he could fully take it in, one of the figures turned their gaze, snapping toward the door. Their eyes locked onto his. Ethan's blood ran cold. For a split second, time seemed to freeze as their eyes met. The figure's gaze was sharp, calculating, and for some reason, it sent a chill down his spine. He had made a mistake. He knew it in his gut. The room, the monitors, the woman in charge. He wasn't supposed to be here. And now they knew. His heart raced. Every instinct screamed for him to flee, to run back up the stairs and out into the safety of the airport. But his body refused to move. He was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the weight of their attention. He could feel the tension in the air thickening, like something monumental was about to happen. Before he could react, the door behind him swung open with a force that startled him. Ethan spun around, his body finally obeying his fear. But it was too late. Two men in black uniforms stepped into the hallway, their movements swift and precise. Their faces were expressionless, their eyes cold and calculating. "You're not supposed to be here," one of the men said, his voice low and dangerous. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, to stammer out some sort of excuse, but no sound came. His mind raced, searching for words, an explanation, anything that could explain why he was in this forbidden place. But his body was frozen, unable to do anything but stare at the two men. The second man took a step forward, his eyes narrowing as he scanned Ethan's face. There was no warmth in his gaze, only the sharp scrutiny of someone who knew exactly what to look for. Ethan's breath hitched. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding. These men weren't airport security. They were something else, something far more dangerous. One of the men reached out, grabbing Ethan's arm in a vice-like grip. Ethan tried to pull away, but the man's hold was unyielding. With a swift motion, they turned him around and began pushing him toward the door. Ethan's mind was spinning. What had he stumbled into? What was happening in this airport? He tried to think, tried to reason, but the questions only became more tangled. The underground tunnels, the strange symbols, the hidden room with the monitors. None of it made sense. And the woman at the head of the table, the one who had locked eyes with him. What was her role in all of this? Before he could form another thought, the men ushered him down the hall and into a small, dimly lit room. It was stark and empty, save for a single metal chair in the center. The walls were bare, and the air felt unnaturally cold, like the temperature had dropped several degrees. The men didn't speak as they shoved him into the chair, securing his wrists with handcuffs that bit into his skin. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Ethan alone in the cold silence. He could still hear the faint hum of machinery through the walls, but everything else was muffled, almost as if he were in a soundproof box. His mind raced. What was going on? Why was he being held here? Was this related to the secrets beneath the airport? Had he uncovered something that someone didn't want him to see? Ethan closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing. His head was spinning, the panic setting in. He had no idea how long he would be kept in this room, or if he would even make it out alive. The figures in the hidden room, the security guards, the cold, calculated look in their eyes, all of it pointed to something much darker than he had imagined. Hours passed. Maybe it was minutes. Time lost all meaning in that room. Ethan couldn't tell how long he had been there when the door opened again, this time more slowly. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. The two men from earlier stepped into the room, their expressions as unreadable as before. "You've seen too much," one of the men said, his voice colder now, tinged with something Ethan couldn't place. "I didn't mean to," Ethan said, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper. His throat was dry, his words faltering as he tried to explain. I was curious. I saw the door and—" "Curiosity," the man interrupted, his tone sharp, "can be dangerous." The second man stepped forward, his face illuminated by the harsh light above them. "We've been watching you, from the moment you stepped foot in this airport." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? Who are you?" "We are part of an organization, one that's bigger than you can imagine," the man said. He paused as though letting the words sink in. "You've seen things that no one is supposed to see, and now you have two choices." Ethan swallowed, fear gripping him. "What choices?" "Forget everything," the first man said. "Leave this place and never come back. Or—" He paused, letting the weight of the second option hang in the air. "Or you stay here and become part of something much larger than yourself." The second man stepped closer, his cold gaze locking with Ethan's. "But understand this. Once you make your choice, there's no going back. You'll either disappear into the shadows or be pulled deeper into the web we've woven. Do you understand?" Ethan's mind was racing. There were so many questions he wanted to ask, so many things he wanted to understand, but in that moment, he knew he had no choice. He couldn't walk away from this. He had uncovered too much, and it was clear that someone would go to any lengths to ensure he didn't speak out. But the alternative? What were they asking of him? Could he truly join them, whatever they were? And what would that mean for his future? Ethan's thoughts spiraled. In the end, he knew one thing for certain. Whatever he chose, His life would never be the same. Ethan's heart was pounding in his chest, his thoughts scrambling to make sense of the ultimatum laid before him. His breath was shallow, his palms clammy as the men stood before him, waiting for a response. There was no time for second guessing. The weight of their words had already settled deep within him. This wasn't just some random conspiracy theory anymore. It was real. The secrets beneath the airport, the coded symbols, the hidden room. It all pointed to something vast and shadowy that Ethan had unwittingly stumbled into. The second man's piercing gaze held him captive, like he was trying to look straight into Ethan's soul, measuring his worth, his resolve. Ethan's mind raced. What did become part of something much larger even mean? Was it an offer, a trap? He couldn't afford to make a mistake, but his curiosity was overwhelming. This wasn't just a story anymore. It was the truth, or at least part of it. And he was being offered a chance to understand it fully. "What happens if I choose to forget?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to keep it steady. The first man smirked, almost as if he found Ethan's question amusing. "Then you walk out of here. You forget everything you've seen, and you go on with your life like nothing ever happened." Ethan's pulse quickened. "And if I choose to stay?" The second man's eyes gleamed, something darker lurking in their depths. "You'll be given access to everything, the truth. But it comes with a cost, a price you may not be prepared to pay." "Why me?" Ethan asked, still struggling to understand why they had picked him. "Why not anyone else?" "Because you found us," the first man replied. "And once you've seen what's hidden, there's no turning back. The only way out is through. You're already entangled in the web, whether you like it or not." Ethan looked from one man to the other, his mind a whirlwind of doubt, fear, and curiosity. Was this a chance to uncover something truly earth-shattering? Or was it a way to pull him deeper into a dark world that he wouldn't be able to escape from? Could he walk away, forget everything, and return to his life as it was? Or would he be forced to carry the burden of the truth with him, knowing that he could never go back? He couldn't decide. The idea of walking away seemed impossible, like he would always be haunted by what he had seen, by the things he had heard in that hidden room. Yet the thought of diving deeper into whatever this organization was terrified him. His gut told him that there was no coming back from either choice. Before he could answer, the door to the room opened again, and another figure stepped inside. This time, a woman, her sharp features set in an expression of cold authority. She moved like a predator, her heels clicking softly on the floor as she approached them. There was a palpable shift in the atmosphere, as if her presence carried weight, a silent command that made everything around her feel smaller. "Is he ready?" she asked, her voice low but commanding. The two men exchanged a brief glance before the first man nodded. "He's still deciding." The woman's gaze flicked to Ethan. Her eyes narrowed slightly as if she could see into his very thoughts, weighing him, assessing him in the space of a few seconds. She stepped forward, stopping just in front of him. Her presence was overwhelming, and for a moment Ethan felt like he was in the presence of someone far more powerful than any of the other figures he had encountered. "You have a choice, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice cool but firm. "But let me tell you this. What you've seen so far is only the surface. If you decide to stay, you'll be forced to face things that will change the way you view the world forever, and there's no undoing that. The truth isn't something you can walk away from. You'll be in too deep." Ethan swallowed hard, her words settling over him like a heavy shroud. The woman wasn't offering him just a chance to learn the truth. She was warning him, and somehow, that only made him more desperate to understand what lay beneath all the secrecy. "What happens if I leave?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you leave, you live your life as you were," the woman replied. "But you will always wonder what you missed. And I promise you, The things you'll learn here will haunt you. You can pretend it didn't happen, but the truth will always be there, just beyond your reach. You can never truly forget. Ethan looked at the men, then back at the woman. Their words were all starting to blur together, but one thing was clear. He couldn't go back to his normal life. The moment he stepped foot in this airport, everything changed. The question wasn't whether he could go back. It was whether he was willing to keep going, knowing that the truth was out there, hidden just beneath the surface. "I'll stay," Ethan said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I want to know." The woman gave him a small, satisfied smile, as if she had expected this answer all along. "Very well," she said, turning toward the door. "Follow me." The two men stepped aside, allowing Ethan to rise from the chair. He felt a strange weight in his chest, a mix of fear and anticipation. He didn't know what awaited him, but he knew that it was far beyond anything he could have imagined. As he followed the woman down the hall, the hum of machinery grew louder, as if guiding him deeper into the heart of the airport's secrets. They walked through a series of dark, narrow corridors, each one more unfamiliar than the last. The air felt colder here, the faint smell of metal and something sterile filling his nostrils. The walls were bare, almost oppressive in their starkness. He couldn't help but feel like he was descending into something forbidden, something that had been hidden for a reason. Finally, they arrived at a large steel door, its surface sleek and unmarked, standing out starkly against the dull concrete walls. The woman turned to Ethan and gave him a brief nod. "This is where it all begins." She entered the code on a keypad beside the door, and with a soft click, the door swung open. The room beyond was vast, much larger than he had expected. It was filled with high-tech equipment, monitors flashing with data he couldn't comprehend, and a large table covered in papers, blueprints, and maps. But what stood out the most was the group of people gathered around the table. They were all dressed in dark suits, their faces hidden in the shadows, but the intensity in their eyes was unmistakable. One of them looked up, his gaze locking onto Ethan. The air in the room shifted, and Ethan felt his heart race. He had crossed a line now. There was no turning back. The figure who had locked eyes with Ethan didn't say a word at first. He simply studied him, his expression unreadable. Ethan stood frozen in the doorway, feeling the weight of the room's silence pressing down on him. The low hum of the machinery seemed to vibrate through his chest, making him feel both hyper-aware and oddly detached from his own body. Every instinct told him to run, but the pull of the mystery was too strong. He had come this far, and now he was here. "Come in, Mr. Hayes," the figure said at last, his voice deep and measured, almost like it was laced with some kind of unseen power. "You've made the right choice." Ethan didn't move immediately. His mind was racing. What was this place? What were these people? Why had they brought him here? His eyes scanned the room quickly, taking in the high-tech equipment, the flickering monitors, and the strange, almost futuristic vibe of the space. This was no ordinary office or meeting room. It was more like a command center, a place where secrets were monitored, not shared. The woman who had led him here gave him a small, knowing smile as she stepped aside to allow him to enter. She closed the door behind him, locking it with a sharp click, and the sound reverberated in the stillness of the room. The others around the table continued to watch him with an eerie, almost clinical interest. Their faces were concealed in shadow, but the presence they exuded was undeniable. They were powerful, controlling something bigger than Ethan could yet understand. "Mr. Hayes," the man at the head of the table spoke again. "Do you know why you're here?" Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. I'm not sure. I found the door. I saw things I shouldn't have." The man's lips curled into a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're here because you saw the door, yes, but more importantly, You're here because you're the one who found it. That's not something just anyone can do. Ethan's brow furrowed in confusion. What do you mean? What's so special about me? The woman, who had been standing silently by the wall, stepped forward now. Her presence was commanding, and her eyes, cold and calculating, seemed to pierce through him. It's not about you, Mr. Hayes. It's about your curiosity. The ability to look beyond the surface. Most people would have dismissed the strange signs, the symbols, the oddities of this place. But you didn't. You questioned. You sought answers. Ethan felt a pang of unease. I didn't know what I was walking into. I was curious. And then I saw things. The murals. The symbols. The people in the hidden room. The man at the head of the table leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table's edge. You've seen only a fraction of the truth. What you saw in that hidden room, the symbols, the murals, they're part of a much larger puzzle, one that we've been working on for years. Puzzle? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, the woman replied, her voice smooth and steady. A puzzle of power, control, and influence. A puzzle that spans decades and perhaps centuries. Ethan's head was spinning. What do you mean? Who are you people? The figure at the head of the table stood up, his dark suit catching the dim light of the room. As he spoke, there was an air of authority that seemed to command the space. We are a group that operates in the shadows, pulling the strings behind the scenes. Our influence extends into governments, corporations, and even the very foundation of society itself. But we don't work for power. No, we work for something much more important. We work for knowledge, for truth. The room felt colder as the man spoke, his words like a weight pressing down on Ethan. His mind struggled to process the enormity of what was being said. Knowledge, truth. Was this some kind of secret society? Was he really standing in the midst of something that powerful, something that had been operating in the background for years without anyone knowing? The man continued. The murals you saw? They're just a small part of the picture, a coded message, a warning, and a clue all at once. But the truth behind those images? It's much darker, much more dangerous than you can imagine. And now, you're part of it. You've seen too much to walk away. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. I never wanted to be a part of this, he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. I didn't ask for any of this. You don't get to choose what you're a part of, Mr. Hayes, the woman said coldly. The moment you walked into this airport, the moment you saw those murals, you sealed your fate. Now, you have to decide whether you'll embrace the truth or live the rest of your life knowing it's just out of reach. The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. Ethan felt like he was suffocating. This was too much, too overwhelming. How had he gotten here? Why had he let his curiosity lead him down this path? But before he could speak, the man at the table gestured for him to sit. We've been watching you for a long time, Mr. Hayes. We know your every move, and we've made a decision. You have potential, the same potential that allowed you to see what others have missed. We're offering you a choice. Ethan stared at him, his thoughts a jumbled mess. A choice? He repeated, his voice cracking. Yes, the man said. You can leave and forget everything you've seen. We'll erase your memory, and you'll go back to your life as if none of this ever happened. Or, he paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. You can stay and join us. Become a part of this operation. You'll have access to information you can't even begin to imagine. But it will cost you. You'll have to commit yourself fully to the cause. Your life will never be the same again. You will never be able to walk away. Ethan's stomach churned. Was it really a choice? Or was this a way to draw him in, to trap him in a life of secrecy and manipulation? How could he possibly make such a decision? The woman stepped closer, her eyes hard and cold. Think carefully, Mr. Hayes. This isn't just about knowledge. This is about power, about control, about shaping the future. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. He had no idea what he was getting himself into. But one thing was clear. His life would never be the same, no matter which path he chose. The silence in the room grew thick as the decision loomed over him, each option as dangerous as the other. The choice was his, but the consequences, he could already feel them closing in. Ethan sat in the chair, his fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His heart raced in his chest, and the room felt like it was closing in around him. He had never been one to make impulsive decisions, but now he was faced with an impossible choice. Leave and erase everything, or stay and dive deeper into a world he didn't understand. The woman's cold eyes were locked on him, waiting for his answer. The silence stretched on, unbearable and thick. Every moment felt like a lifetime, every breath labored. In the back of his mind, he could hear his logical side screaming at him to walk away, to forget what he had seen, but his curiosity, his drive to understand, to unravel the mystery, pushed him to keep listening. "How can I trust you?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper, his throat tight with tension. "You've been watching me. You know everything about me. Why should I believe you? Why should I believe any of this is real?" The man at the head of the table smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Trust is a luxury in our line of work, Mr. Hayes," he said smoothly. "You don't have to trust us. You just have to make a decision. The truth is rarely comfortable, but it's always powerful. What we offer you is power, information, the kind of knowledge that can change the world." Ethan swallowed hard, the words echoing in his mind. Power, information. He had always wanted answers. That's why he was here. But now, with the weight of their words pressing down on him, he couldn't help but wonder what kind of cost was involved. "You say this is bigger than I can imagine," Ethan said, his voice a little stronger now, though the fear still gnawed at him. "What's the catch? What do you want from me?" The woman stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she spoke. "We want your commitment, Mr. Hayes. Complete and total commitment. You'll join us. Work with us. You'll be part of something that goes beyond any conspiracy theory you've ever heard. What we do, what we've done for decades, is change the course of history. We've influenced governments, corporations, economies. You will be a part of that." Ethan could feel the weight of their words settling over him like a blanket of cold fear. He had always thought of himself as an ordinary man, a man who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But now, he was being asked to step into a world he couldn't begin to comprehend. Could he really be a part of something so vast? Could he handle the power that came with knowing secrets that had been buried for so long? "What happens if I refuse?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. The man at the table shifted slightly, his gaze hardening. "Refusal isn't an option, Mr. Hayes. You've seen too much already. If you walk away, we'll ensure that you forget. Your mind will be wiped clean, and your life will return to the ordinary. But you will never escape the knowledge of what's out there. You will live in the shadows, always wondering what could have been." Ethan's stomach twisted. The idea of forgetting everything was tempting, almost soothing. He could walk away from all of this, go back to his old life, his safe, predictable existence. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be enough. He would always wonder. The knowledge would haunt him, like a ghost he couldn't shake. He glanced at the other figures around the table. They were watching him closely, their faces still obscured in shadow. There was no doubt in his mind now that they were not ordinary people. They were something more, powerful, secretive, and dangerous. "All right," Ethan said, his voice steady now, though his heart was still racing. "I'll stay. I want to know everything." A faint smile appeared on the woman's lips, and for a moment, It seemed like she was pleased with his decision. The man at the head of the table nodded, as if this was the outcome they had anticipated. "Very well," he said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "From this moment on, you're one of us. But understand, Mr. Hayes, there's no going back. The truth you will learn will change you. It will change the way you see the world. And it will demand sacrifices. Sacrifices you may not be ready for." Ethan nodded, though the words felt like a warning he couldn't quite shake. He had made his decision, but as he stood up from the table, a sense of dread filled him. He had chosen the unknown over safety, and now he would have to face whatever came next. The woman turned toward the door. "Follow me," she said, her voice cold and commanding. Ethan followed her down another narrow corridor, the same sterile metallic smell in the air. The farther they walked, the more isolated he felt. It was as if they were moving deeper into the heart of the airport, into a place where reality itself seemed to bend and warp. The lights above flickered intermittently, casting shadows on the walls, creating an almost dreamlike atmosphere. They reached a door at the end of the hall. Unlike the others, this one was made of reinforced steel, the kind of door you'd expect to find in a high-security facility. The woman punched in a code on the keypad, and the door opened with a loud hiss. Inside was a large, dimly lit room. At the center stood a massive console covered in monitors and buttons, all of which seemed to pulse with a strange energy. A group of technicians sat at the console, their faces illuminated by the glow of the screens. They were typing furiously, analyzing data, and occasionally speaking in low, urgent tones. The air in the room felt charged, almost electric, as if the very atmosphere was alive with activity. "This is where we work," the woman said, turning to Ethan. "This is where the true power lies. What we've built here is not just an operation, it's a network, one that spans the globe, influencing events, people, and the very course of history itself." Ethan stepped further into the room, his eyes scanning the monitors, trying to make sense of the flashing data. But it was all too much, too fast. He couldn't understand any of it. It was like stepping into a world he wasn't ready for, a world that was light years ahead of everything he had known. "You will be trained," the woman continued, her tone matter of fact. "You'll learn how to operate within this network, how to gather information, manipulate events, and, if necessary, eliminate threats to the operation." Ethan felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Eliminate threats. What had he gotten himself into? Was this really what he wanted? But the question was no longer relevant. He had made his choice. And now, there was no turning back. Ethan stood in the room, the hum of machinery and the flashing monitors around him growing louder. Every instinct he had screamed for him to run, to turn back to the normal, quiet life he once knew. But he had already crossed the threshold. The choice was made. Now, there was no escaping what he had become a part of. The woman, who had yet to give her name, motioned for him to follow her again. She led him to a side room, one that seemed even more isolated from the rest of the operation. The walls were lined with more monitors, and the atmosphere was colder, more calculated. There were no technicians here, only rows of files and bookshelves filled with dossiers, each one labeled with a set of numbers and codes Ethan couldn't begin to decipher. "This," she said, gesturing to the room, "is where we keep the most sensitive information. It's here you will begin your training. You'll learn to operate in the shadows just like the rest of us, how to gather intelligence, manipulate the course of events, and how to keep a low profile while doing it." Ethan's gaze lingered on the files. Some of them were thick, others just thin folders, but all of them seemed to carry the weight of something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. He had walked into a world that was vast and dark, and now, there was no way out. "Is this how you've been controlling everything?" he asked, his voice trembling despite his attempt to sound confident. "Through all of this secrecy. The operations?" The woman looked at him sharply, her eyes calculating. It's not control, Mr. Hayes. It's influence. We guide the course of history without ever revealing our hand. You'll understand soon enough. What we do is necessary. You may not agree with it at first, but eventually you'll see the bigger picture. We aren't just pulling strings. We're shaping the future. The weight of her words hung heavily in the air, and Ethan had no choice but to follow. He wasn't entirely sure what he was getting into, but there was a part of him that couldn't help but be intrigued. He had lived his life seeking answers, and now he was standing at the crossroads of a mystery bigger than he could ever fathom. The woman handed him a thick file, the same kind as the ones on the shelves, and nodded. This is your first assignment. You'll study it thoroughly, learn every detail. You'll need it for what's coming next. Ethan took the file, the weight of it settling heavily in his hands. He opened it slowly, trying to brace himself for what he would find. Inside, there were photographs, grainy images of various locations, individuals he didn't recognize, and places he had never been. There were also maps, charts, and a lot of coded language. It looked like an operation, something covert, something dangerous. But the deeper he dug into the file, the more confused he became. "Who are these people?" he asked, pointing to one of the photographs. "What's all this?" The woman's expression hardened. "Those are people who have crossed us, or people we've been watching. Some of them are allies. Others, well, you'll learn soon enough who can be trusted and who can't. Just know this. What we do isn't black and white. We operate in the gray." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He wasn't sure if the people in the file were enemies or potential recruits. But one thing was clear. He was being thrust into a world that was as much about manipulation as it was about secrecy. "You'll start by learning our protocols," the woman continued. "The first step is understanding the network. It's vast, spanning multiple countries, companies, and organizations. We have operatives in places you would never suspect. Your job will be to assist with gathering information, managing intelligence, and, when necessary, executing certain missions." Ethan's mind was racing. He wasn't sure what kind of operations he was being asked to join, but one thing was clear. The lines between right and wrong were already beginning to blur. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth anymore. This was about living it. And in the shadows, the truth was often more dangerous than the lies. "Before we begin," the woman said, snapping Ethan back to reality, "there's one thing you must understand. You will never have the full picture. You'll never know everything. Some things are too important, too dangerous, for even you to know. Your role is to follow the instructions, gather the information, and execute the tasks we assign you. And when the time comes, you will be asked to make decisions that could change everything. But they must be made swiftly. No hesitation." Ethan felt his stomach churn. Was he prepared to make those kinds of decisions? Could he live with the consequences of his actions, knowing that he was no longer just an observer? He was now part of something much bigger than himself. "I'm not sure I understand," Ethan said, his voice shaky. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" The woman studied him for a moment before answering. "You'll be trained to act in the shadows, to influence events without being noticed. You'll gather intelligence on key individuals and organizations. Some of those you'll help, others you'll bring down. Your loyalty will be tested, but above all, you must remember this. There are no heroes here, only survivors." Ethan took a deep breath, the reality of what he was getting into sinking in. He had already crossed a line. His curiosity had led him here, and now it seemed there was no turning back. "Come with me," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "It's time for your first lesson." Ethan followed her through the dimly lit corridors, each step feeling like he was walking deeper into a labyrinth with no exit. His thoughts raced. He had never asked for this. He hadn't sought out the secrets he had uncovered. But now that he was here, he had no choice but to see it through. The woman led him to a large, circular room with a holographic display in the center. The walls were covered in more screens, each one displaying real-time data from around the world. Ethan's eyes widened as he realized the magnitude of what he was seeing. This was more than just an operation. It was a system that spanned the globe, pulling the strings behind the scenes in ways that Ethan could never have imagined. Ethan's head spun as he took in the full scope of what lay before him. The control center was unlike anything he had ever seen. The holographic display in the center of the room shifted and flickered with a constant stream of data. Live surveillance feeds, financial reports, security clearances, names, and locations. Each one was a piece of a puzzle, a thread in a web so vast and intricate that Ethan could barely comprehend it. He was standing at the heart of something massive, something that controlled far more than he could have imagined. The woman who had led him here stood beside him, her posture straight, her eyes cold. "This," she said, "is where it all begins. You'll be given access to this network soon. But before that, you need to understand the fundamentals." She motioned to one of the large monitors, and a new screen appeared, showing a list of names. Some of them Ethan recognized, others were foreign to him. Each name was followed by a number, a series of encrypted codes that Ethan couldn't even begin to decipher. "You'll learn how to read this information," she continued, her voice devoid of emotion. "It's critical. Each of these individuals plays a part in the network, whether they know it or not. Some are allies, some are threats. You'll have to discern who is who. Your role is to gather intelligence on key players, to monitor their movements, their decisions, and when necessary, to neutralize them." Ethan's mind raced. Neutralize. What did that even mean? He had been led to believe this was about uncovering secrets, understanding the world from a new perspective. But now it was clear. This was no longer about curiosity. It was about power, and with power came responsibility, but also danger. He looked up from the screen, his throat dry. "And what happens if I fail? If I make the wrong call?" The woman's gaze never wavered. "Failure is not an option. The stakes are too high. But we are not heartless. If you make an error, it will be corrected. If you stumble, we will guide you. But understand this. Every decision you make ripples outwards. You can't undo your actions. Once you take part in this network, you are forever bound to it." Ethan's pulse quickened. He had heard her words, but the weight of them didn't truly sink in until now. He wasn't just being asked to observe or learn. He was being asked to play a role in something far more dangerous and covert than he had ever imagined. "You'll begin your training immediately," she said, snapping him back to the present. "We'll start with the basics: how to track a target, how to extract information without detection, and how to stay in the shadows. You'll learn how to use the tools at your disposal, how to manipulate events, and how to ensure that nothing, not even a single detail, escapes your notice." Ethan followed her through the room as she walked him toward a set of terminals along the far wall. The space was sleek, modern, but it felt sterile, almost clinical. There were no personal touches, no signs of humanity. Everything here was built for one thing and one thing only: control. "These terminals are where you'll work," she said, gesturing to the sleek consoles. "You will start by learning how to access the most basic data: communications, financial transactions, and surveillance feeds. But soon you'll be handling more complex operations. You'll track individuals, monitor their connections, and gather intelligence. You'll need to understand every detail, no matter how small." She turned to him then, her gaze sharp. "And when the time comes, you will have to act. Not as a bystander, not as someone who watches from afar. You will be in the field. You will execute decisions that shape the course of history." The gravity of her words hit him like a punch. Execute decisions. He had never imagined that his curiosity would lead him to something like this. An operation so vast, so powerful, and so dangerous. He thought about the life he had before this, his ordinary job, his quiet days. But that world was fading. and the reality of this new one was slowly taking its place. "What do you want me to do first?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. The woman smiled, thin and cold. "First, we see if you can handle the pressure. We'll start with a simple task, a test. You will be given a target, an individual we have been monitoring for some time. Your job will be to gather intel, learn everything you can about them, and report back with your findings." Ethan nodded, his mind already racing. "What's the target?" The woman paused before answering, her eyes narrowing slightly. "A man named Daniel Cole. He's a journalist, one of the few left who still asks the questions most people avoid. He's been sniffing around some of our operations, and he's becoming a liability." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. A journalist? Was this really what he had signed up for? Was he being asked to sabotage someone's career, to destroy their life? "You will monitor him," she continued, as though reading his thoughts. "You will learn everything about him, his contacts, his movements, his interests, and if he becomes too dangerous, you will eliminate him." Ethan felt a sudden rush of nausea. Eliminate. Was that what they meant? He didn't know how to feel about this. He had always considered himself a good person, someone who followed the rules, who believed in justice. But here, in this place, the lines between right and wrong were becoming increasingly blurred. "What happens if I refuse?" Ethan asked, his voice strained with fear and doubt. The woman stepped closer to him, her gaze intense. "Refusal isn't an option. You've already crossed the line, Mr. Hayes. You are one of us now, and if you walk away, we will ensure that you never speak of this again. We will erase your memories, and you will vanish into obscurity. You'll never even remember that you made this choice." Ethan swallowed hard. He had no choice. There was no going back now. "You will begin tonight," the woman said, her voice almost a whisper, as though she were delivering a command, not a suggestion. "Get started. We'll be watching." Ethan nodded, though his mind was a whirl of confusion. His training had begun, but at what cost? He was part of something now, something much larger than he could have imagined. And as he turned to face the terminal, his fingers trembling as he prepared to dive deeper into the network's vast ocean of data, one thing was certain: there was no turning back. Ethan sat at the terminal, the cool blue light of the screen casting shadows across his face as he began to sift through the files. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure of where to start. The sheer volume of data was overwhelming, and he had no idea how to process it all. The woman's words echoed in his mind. "We'll be watching." He felt the pressure of their gaze, even though they weren't physically present. He had never been in a situation like this before, never had to navigate a web of secrecy, manipulation, and power. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth anymore. This was about becoming a part of it, participating in something so far-reaching, so intricate, that it could change everything. He opened the first file about Daniel Cole. The man was well known in journalistic circles for his investigative reporting, but his recent work had begun to touch on some sensitive topics that had drawn unwanted attention. Ethan read through the file, absorbing every detail: Cole's background, his professional relationships, the recent articles he had published, and most importantly, the people he had been in contact with. The more Ethan read, the more unsettled he became. Cole wasn't just a journalist. He was a thorn in the side of powerful people, asking questions that others were too afraid to ask. And now, it seemed, his search for answers had made him a target. As Ethan continued to scroll through the file, he found details about Cole's personal life, his family, his routine, and his connections to various underground movements. There was even a list of Cole's enemies, people who had been threatened or silenced over the years. Ethan's stomach churned as he absorbed the full picture. This was a man who had been fighting for the truth. And now, he was in the crosshairs. But that was the nature of the game, wasn't it? This wasn't about justice. This was about control. The people Ethan had joined were ruthless, and they didn't care about right or wrong. They cared about power, and Cole's pursuit of the truth had made him dangerous to that power. Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of the task settling heavily on his shoulders. He wasn't just gathering information now. He was deciding someone's fate. He could feel the power shifting, the responsibility growing. Could he really do this? Could he really follow through on an order that would destroy someone's life? Someone who was simply doing their job. The terminal beeped, breaking his thoughts. A new message flashed across the screen. It was from the woman, the one who had guided him into this world. He opened it with trembling hands. Report your findings on Daniel Cole. We expect full compliance. You know what to do. His heart sank. It was a command, not a question. And in that moment, Ethan knew that he had already crossed the point of no return. The woman and the others had given him the tools, the knowledge, the power. But with that power came a price that was now staring him in the face. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady his breathing. He had been curious, yes. But this was more than he had ever imagined. The line between right and wrong had been erased, and he was standing on the precipice of something dark and dangerous. Ethan opened his eyes and looked at the file again. There were two choices now. He could continue with the mission, gather the information they wanted, and prepare to execute it. Or he could refuse, walk away, and face the consequences. The consequences of living in the shadows, haunted by the knowledge that he had once had a choice. He clicked on the file containing the details of Cole's contacts. As he studied them, something strange happened. One name stood out, a name he didn't recognize, but one that had been flagged in the file as high priority. He clicked on it, curious. The screen flickered for a moment, and then a new file opened. The man in the file was connected to several high-profile political figures and business moguls, but it was the final line in the file that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. This individual has ties to an underground organization that directly opposes our operations. He is an immediate threat. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning. A new layer of the puzzle had just revealed itself. This wasn't just about Daniel Cole anymore. There were bigger forces at play. Forces that even the organization Ethan had joined seemed to fear. And the more he dug, the deeper the rabbit hole seemed to go. His instincts screamed at him to stop, to walk away and never look back. But there was a part of him, a part he could no longer ignore, that wanted to understand it all, to piece together the fragments of the mystery, to uncover the true power that lay beneath the surface. He took a deep breath and began to type, pulling up more files, analyzing data, connecting dots. This was the beginning of his descent. The deeper he went, the more he realized just how much he had yet to uncover. And as much as he feared what he might find, he couldn't stop himself now. The door to the control center opened and the woman stepped in, her eyes sharp as she studied Ethan's progress. She said nothing at first, simply watching him work. Then, after a long silence, she spoke. "You're doing well, Mr. Hayes, but this is only the beginning. Soon we will need you to take more direct action. Your role is about to shift. You'll need to be ready." Ethan looked up at her, his mind racing. More direct action. What did that even mean? "Ready for what?" he asked, his voice steady despite the unease gnawing at him. The woman's lips curled into a smile. It wasn't reassuring. "You'll know when the time comes. For now, continue with your assignment. The target won't be easy to neutralize, but if anyone can do it, it's you." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. Ethan had already crossed a line. He was being shaped into something he didn't recognize, but there was no way out now. He had made his choice, and in the world he had entered, the consequences of hesitation were far worse than the actions themselves. As the woman left the room, Ethan stared at the screen, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. The assignment was clear, but the more he learned, the more questions arose. He wasn't just a player in someone else's game anymore. He was becoming part of the system that controlled everything. And as Ethan began typing out his final report on Daniel Cole, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was only beginning to understand the dark, dangerous world he had stepped into. There was more at stake now than his own survival. There were secrets here, secrets so deep and so well guarded that they could change everything, and Ethan was about to become their keeper. The hours blurred together as Ethan continued his work, each file and each piece of information drawing him deeper into a world of shadows and secrets. The assignment to monitor Daniel Cole was proving more difficult than he had anticipated. Cole was no ordinary journalist. He had a network of contacts, a level of protection, and a determination that made him a formidable target. Ethan had spent hours combing through his communications, his recent articles, his personal connections, but there were gaps, places where the trail went cold. The more Ethan dug, the more unsettling the truth became. Cole had already uncovered parts of the puzzle Ethan himself was now part of, pieces that could shatter the very foundation of the organization. If Cole wasn't eliminated, if he kept asking the right questions, he could expose everything. That thought alone made Ethan's skin crawl. He was beginning to understand the stakes, the ruthless nature of the people he had aligned himself with. But then, something strange happened. As Ethan was scrolling through a series of encrypted messages Cole had received, one name kept appearing: Dr. Benjamin Ward. At first, Ethan thought it was just another contact, just another name in a long list of people connected to Cole. But as he dug deeper, the name began to ring familiar. It wasn't just a name. It was the name of a person involved in some of the most controversial operations in history. Ward had ties to several research projects, many of which were tied to the very organization Ethan was now working for. And yet, the file on Ward was different. The information was sparse, almost as if someone had intentionally hidden it. Ethan's heart raced as he pulled up more data, connecting dots between Ward and various high-level operations. Ward had been working on something, a project so secret that even the network didn't have complete access to it. It was classified under multiple levels of clearance, and the few details Ethan could uncover were chilling. There was a mention of an experiment, something about temporal manipulation. Ethan's mind raced. Time manipulation. Could it be possible? Was this what the organization had been hiding? Was this the ultimate weapon they had been working on all these years? Suddenly, a notification appeared on his screen. The woman, the one who had introduced him to this world, was requesting a direct communication. Ethan's pulse quickened as he clicked the link, the weight of his discovery still heavy in his mind. The screen flickered for a moment before her face appeared. Her eyes were sharp, calculating as always, but there was something different in her demeanor this time. Something colder. "Mr. Hayes," she began, her voice calm and measured. "I trust you've been making progress with your assignment." Ethan hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to proceed. Should he tell her what he had found? The mention of temporal manipulation was too significant, too dangerous to ignore. But he knew better than to show his cards too early. The game was still in play, and he couldn't afford to reveal any weakness. "Not yet. I've been following the leads," Ethan said, his voice steady. "Cole is proving to be a bit more elusive than I expected, but I'll have a full report soon." The woman's expression didn't change, but Ethan could sense the subtle shift in her tone. "You're not here to play games, Mr. Hayes. You've been given an assignment and I expect you to follow through. No distractions." Ethan felt a flash of frustration, but he kept his emotions in check. Distractions. As if the discovery of temporal manipulation was a minor detail. But he said nothing, simply nodding in acknowledgement. "I understand," he replied. "I'll complete the assignment as instructed." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, studying him. Good. But I need to remind you, Mr. Hayes, that we are monitoring you. We're watching everything you do, every move you make. If you deviate from the plan, if you show any signs of hesitation, there will be consequences. Ethan swallowed hard, the pressure mounting. This was no longer just about uncovering secrets. This was about survival. He had entered a world where mistakes were unforgivable, where every decision could have lasting, irreversible consequences. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on him, making his chest tighten with unease. I won't fail, Ethan said, his voice unwavering despite the turmoil inside. The woman studied him for a long moment before nodding once. Good, stay focused. You have your orders. And remember, time is not on your side. With that, she ended the call, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts. He sat there for a long moment, the silence in the room almost suffocating. His hands were shaking slightly as he looked back at the screen. The task ahead of him was clear, but the deeper he dug into Cole's life, the more tangled the web became. And now, with Dr. Ward's name surfacing, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something far larger than he could understand. Was the organization hiding something about time itself? Could they really manipulate it? The idea seemed absurd, even impossible, but the more he thought about it, the more certain he became that there was something hidden here, something buried deep within the organization that was far beyond anything he had imagined. Was Cole really the threat the organization thought he was? Or was he simply digging too close to the truth? Ethan's mind raced as he sifted through the files on Dr. Ward, looking for any further clues. There were few concrete details, just vague references to classified experiments and encrypted communications, but it was enough to know that Ward was involved in something big, something dangerous, and something that might change everything. Ethan didn't know what it was, but he couldn't ignore it. He closed the file and leaned back in his chair, staring at the dimly lit room around him. The organization had given him a task, but now Ethan had a new mission of his own, one that went far beyond simply gathering intelligence on Daniel Cole. He needed to uncover the truth about Dr. Ward, about what he had been working on, and about the terrifying possibility of manipulating time itself. And as Ethan's thoughts swirled, one question echoed in his mind. Was the organization manipulating time for their own gain, or was something far darker at play? Ethan's mind raced as he dug deeper into Dr. Benjamin Ward's files. The more he uncovered, the more disturbing it became. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered across multiple, highly secure servers, each entry more encrypted and more guarded than the last. But something about Dr. Ward's research felt too important, too dangerous, for him to back away now. There was a sense of urgency building inside him, a gnawing feeling that time was running out, and not just for him, but for everyone involved. Ward's name kept surfacing in the most unexpected places. Military reports, government contracts, corporate sponsorships, research funded by organizations with names Ethan didn't recognize, but whose influence could be felt in every corner of the globe. Ward had been connected to some of the most controversial projects in modern history, projects that spanned multiple governments and industries. But there was one document that stood out above the rest. A heavily redacted report buried deep within the archives that mentioned something called Project Kronos. It was the kind of file that would make any ordinary person walk away, dismissing it as a ridiculous conspiracy. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this was no accident. This was the thread he needed to pull on. With a few deft keystrokes, he decrypted the file. The screen flickered before revealing the first few lines of text. His eyes scanned the words quickly, his heart beginning to race. Project Kronos, temporal manipulation and the rewriting of historical events. The words hit him like a jolt of electricity. Temporal manipulation, the ability to change time. This wasn't just science fiction anymore. This was real. The document went on to describe experiments involving the manipulation of time through highly classified scientific methods. The idea, as abstract as it sounded, was based on the principle that time could be bent, redirected, or even rewritten to achieve desired outcomes. It mentioned test subjects, controlled environments, and data that was far too detailed to dismiss as mere fantasy. Ethan's eyes widened as he scrolled through the document. He had been right. This was the reason Dr. Ward was so heavily protected. This was the core of the operation. The ability to alter time itself could change the balance of power in the world, and those who held that power would stop at nothing to protect it. As Ethan absorbed the document, the implications of what he was reading began to settle in. This wasn't just about surveillance, information control, or influencing global events. This was about control in its purest form. Control over the very fabric of reality. The file continued with descriptions of successes in the experiments. The manipulation of time had been tested with various objects, first with inanimate ones, then with living beings. The results were shocking, even disturbing. Objects sent back in time had been reported as changed, altered in ways that could not be explained. But the real breakthrough had come when they began testing on humans. Humans. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he read further. The document mentioned volunteers who had undergone procedures that involved traveling through altered time frames. Some had been reported missing, others had returned with altered memories, and a few had never come back at all. The experiment was still in its early stages, and the ethical implications had been brushed aside as necessary sacrifices. The final lines of the file were the most chilling. The potential applications of Project Chronos are limitless. Time itself is the ultimate tool for shaping reality. We must ensure that control of Project Chronos remains in the hands of those who understand its true power. Ethan sat back in his chair, stunned. He couldn't believe what he had just read. The organization he had joined, the people who had manipulated him into this game, were involved in something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. They weren't just shaping history, they were rewriting it. And the man behind it all, the one with the knowledge to control time itself, was Dr. Benjamin Ward. His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. "Mr. Hayes," the voice of the woman echoed through the door. "It's time." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He stood up quickly, his hands shaking. Time. The very thing that had just been used as a weapon. His mind was racing. He had barely begun to grasp the enormity of what he was learning, and now he was being called to execute a task that could potentially bring everything crashing down. He quickly shut down the terminal, locking the information away for the moment. There was no time to lose. The woman was waiting. He opened the door to find her standing there, her expression unreadable as always. "Come with me," she said curtly. Ethan followed her through the corridors once more, the walls narrowing, closing in on him. His heart was pounding in his chest. Was it too late to back out? Could he even back out at this point? The decision was already made. The consequences were set in motion, and there was no room for hesitation. He had seen too much, learned too much. There was no way out. They reached a small elevator, one that Ethan had never noticed before. The woman entered, and he followed suit, the door closing with a soft, almost ominous hiss. The elevator descended quickly, the lights flickering as they went deeper into the heart of the facility. When the doors opened, they revealed a darkened room. At the far end stood a figure, tall, with a commanding presence, his face partially obscured by shadows. Ethan recognized him immediately. It was one of the high-ranking members of the organization. "Mr. Hayes," the man said in a low, steady voice. "You've been doing well, but it's time to move forward. The next phase begins now." Ethan's stomach churned. This was it. He had been pushed to the edge. And now there was no more room for doubt. He had chosen this path, and now it was time to see where it would lead. "Your first task is to ensure the target is eliminated," the man continued. "You've gathered the intelligence. Now you must act. Daniel Cole must be silenced, permanently. He's getting too close to the truth, and that cannot be allowed." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "Eliminate him." The word sent a cold wave of fear through him. Was he really ready for this? Could he go through with it? He glanced at the woman who stood silently at his side, her expression unwavering. She had already made it clear that there was no turning back. "Do you understand?" the man asked again, his voice firm. Ethan nodded slowly, though his mind was in turmoil. His thoughts flashed back to the files he had uncovered, the chilling details about Project Kronos, the dark secrets buried deep within the organization. Was this really what he had been drawn into? Was this how the world was truly shaped? But he had already made his choice. "I understand," he replied, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. The man smiled, a cold, calculating smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Good. Then go, Mr. Hayes. Do what you must." Ethan took one last look at the darkened room, feeling the weight of the task ahead of him. As he turned and walked toward the exit, his mind was clouded with doubt. But he knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back now. Ethan stepped into the cold hallway, the weight of the man's words hanging in the air like a thick fog. The task ahead of him was clear. Eliminate Daniel Cole. The command echoed in his mind, louder with each step. He couldn't help but wonder what had led him here. Was this who he had become now? A mere instrument of destruction, following orders with no question, no hesitation. He walked through the halls of the facility, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing. His thoughts returned to the file he had uncovered on Dr. Ward. Temporal manipulation, the ability to bend time itself. The implications were enormous, far beyond anything Ethan had ever imagined. This was no longer just about control. This was about altering the very fabric of reality. Ethan had always considered himself a man of reason, a man who believed in facts, in evidence, in logic. But now, he was standing at the edge of a precipice. The world he thought he knew was unraveling, and the more he dug, the more he realized just how deep the deception went. His role in this world, this operation, was growing clearer with every passing moment, and it terrified him. He reached the elevator and stepped inside, his reflection staring back at him in the polished metal. What have I become? He wondered. A puppet, a tool for someone else's game? Or was he part of something bigger, something that could change the course of history? The elevator door closed with a soft ding, and Ethan descended into the depths of the facility. The air grew colder as he traveled deeper, the hum of machinery growing louder, almost suffocating. He knew what awaited him now. He had been prepared for this moment for weeks, ever since the woman first introduced him to this world. But no amount of preparation could have shielded him from the dread now coiling in his stomach. When the elevator finally reached its destination, the doors opened to reveal a small, dimly lit room. The woman was waiting for him. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice cold and calculating. Ethan nodded, his throat dry. Ready? He wasn't sure. He wasn't sure of anything anymore. But he couldn't go back now. There was no turning back. "Good," she said, stepping aside to reveal a set of files spread across a table in the center of the room. "These are the final details on your target, Daniel Cole. You'll find everything you need here." Ethan walked over to the table, his fingers brushing over the folders. The weight of the decision was crushing, but he knew what needed to be done. He had learned too much about Cole's research, his connections, and his pursuit of the truth. The man had become a liability. The network couldn't allow him to expose what they had worked so hard to conceal. As Ethan flipped through the files, he saw photographs of Cole, images of him in various places, talking to people, digging deeper into the conspiracy that surrounded them all. There were details about Cole's whereabouts, his movements, his schedule, everything Ethan needed to execute the plan. "This is the point of no return, Mr. Hayes," the woman said, her voice sharp and unwavering. "You're the one who will ensure that Cole stays silent. You have everything you need. It's time to act." Ethan's fingers hovered over the file, his mind a storm of conflicting thoughts. Was this really the right thing to do? Was this the man he had become? Or was he just a pawn in a much larger game? The woman had been right when she said there was no turning back. He had already crossed a line, and now it seemed that there was no way to undo it. He looked up at her, his voice trembling slightly. "And if I can't do it, what happens then?" Her gaze was as cold as ever. "Failure isn't an option. You will succeed, Mr. Hayes. Or you will be dealt with." The weight of her words hit him like a physical blow. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for, but the moment he feared, too. Ethan stood there facing the files, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He had been trained for this moment, prepared for it. But no amount of training could have prepared him for the reality of what he was about to do. He thought of Daniel Cole, the journalist who had dared to ask the questions everyone else was too afraid to ask, the man who had come too close to uncovering the truth. Ethan had been hired to silence him. But what did that mean for him? What did that mean for the truth? His mind flashed back to the file on Dr. Ward, the mention of Project Kronos, the manipulation of time itself. What was all of this really about? Was it about control? About rewriting history? Or was there something darker lurking beneath it all? He grabbed the files, his hands shaking, and walked toward the door. The woman was already waiting, her expression unchanged. "You know what you must do, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice cold and final. "There's no going back." As Ethan stepped out into the hallway, he felt the weight of her words settling on his shoulders. He had crossed a line. He was no longer just an observer in this game. He was part of it, part of something far larger and far darker than he had ever imagined. He had been given an assignment, but now he realized the true mission was just beginning. He wasn't sure if he could live with the choices he was about to make, but there was no choice now. There was only the mission. And as he walked toward the exit, his mind replaying the events of the past few weeks, one question echoed in his mind. Who would I be when this is all over? Ethan stepped out into the cold night air, the city around him cloaked in darkness. He barely registered the bustle of pedestrians or the hum of distant cars. His mind was consumed by the task at hand. Daniel Cole had to be silenced. The command was clear, and the woman's words were still ringing in his ears. Failure isn't an option. He had been given the location, an address in the heart of the city, Cole's office. It was a small, inconspicuous place, nestled between other businesses that seemed just as ordinary. But Ethan knew better. It was the heart of Cole's operations, where he pieced together the truth. And tonight, it would be the place where Ethan's role in the system would come full circle. The drive was short, but every passing minute felt like an eternity. Ethan's hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. The weight of the decision loomed larger with each second. Was this really what he wanted? Was he capable of carrying out what was expected of him? His thoughts scattered, conflicted. But somewhere beneath the uncertainty, the decision was made. He had crossed the point of no return. He pulled into a parking garage near Cole's office. The place was almost eerily quiet. A few cars scattered about, but most of the spaces were empty. The silence was deafening. He exited the car, checking his watch. 2:45 a.m. The city was still asleep, but Ethan knew that Cole never slept. Not anymore. The journalist was too close to discovering the truth. Ethan took a deep breath, steadying himself. His footsteps echoed as he made his way down the concrete corridor toward the stairwell. He had done this many times in the past, following orders, infiltrating, collecting information. But this time was different. This time, the target wasn't just someone who needed to be watched. It was someone who needed to disappear. As he approached Cole's office, his heart pounded in his chest. He hadn't been given specifics on how to execute the task. It didn't matter. In this world, there was no room for hesitation. He had the tools. He had the knowledge. All that was left was the action. He slipped into the building through the back door, using a keycard that had been handed to him earlier. The office was eerily quiet, save for the low hum of a few computers still running. The faint glow of a desk lamp illuminated the cluttered room. Files were scattered across the desk. Open notebooks filled with scribbled notes and references to names, dates, and places. There he was, Daniel Cole, sitting at his desk, as though he had never left. His back was to Ethan, but the faint sound of his breathing told Ethan everything he needed to know. Cole wasn't asleep. He was working. He was always working. Ethan hesitated for a moment. In the darkness of the office, he couldn't help but feel a sense of respect for the man. Cole wasn't some ordinary journalist. He was a man driven by an unrelenting pursuit of truth, a man willing to dig into the darkest corners of society. And Ethan was about to end that. He stepped forward, his footsteps barely making a sound on the carpeted floor. As he approached Cole's desk, he saw the photographs, images of powerful people, of names Ethan recognized. There were notes scribbled in the margins, arrows connecting dots, highlighting key pieces of information. For a moment, Ethan just stood there, frozen, staring at the desk. Cole had been so close. He had almost connected the final pieces of the puzzle, the pieces Ethan had been tasked to keep hidden. And now, Ethan was here to erase all of it. But then, Cole shifted in his chair. He turned slightly, as if sensing something in the air. His eyes met Ethan's, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. "You're here," Cole said quietly, his voice calm but laced with an undertone of recognition. Ethan froze. How had Cole known? Had he been tipped off? Or had he simply been waiting for this moment? "I knew you'd come for me," Cole continued, his gaze unwavering. "You've been following me for weeks, haven't you?" Ethan's heart raced. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Cole was supposed to be unaware, caught off guard, easy to eliminate. But this was different. Cole was not afraid. He was calm. And worse, he knew exactly who Ethan was. Ethan tried to steady himself, but his hand trembled as he reached for the gun at his side. He had to do this. There was no other choice. He had to silence Cole, no matter what. "Why?" Cole asked, his voice soft. "Why are you doing this?" Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. He couldn't answer him. His mind was a swirl of confusion, his thoughts tangled in the weight of what he was about to do. "You've been part of this system long enough to know the truth, Ethan," Cole continued, his voice calm and steady. "But you don't have to be. You can walk away from this. You can still make a choice." Ethan felt a pang of doubt, a flicker of something deep inside him that screamed for him to stop. Could he? Could he walk away from the life he had been pulled into? The organization, the manipulation, the lies? Could he truly turn his back on everything he had worked toward? But then the reality set in. He couldn't walk away. Not now. Not after everything he had seen. "I can't," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Cole smiled sadly, a knowing look in his eyes. "You're already a part of it, aren't you? You've been played, just like the rest of us." Ethan tightened his grip on the gun. There was no more room for second guessing. The mission had to be completed. Before he could make a move, Cole stood up slowly, his hands raised in a gesture of calm. "You don't have to do this, Ethan. You don't have to be their puppet. For the first time, Ethan's resolve wavered. Could Cole be right? Was he just a pawn in a game far bigger than he could comprehend? Or was this just the reality he had been thrust into, with no way out? Ethan took a step forward, his finger on the trigger. This was it, the end of the line. But then, in that split second, the door behind him swung open. The woman entered, her cold gaze fixing on him immediately. "It's time," she said, her voice hard, devoid of any compassion. "The mission is complete." Ethan turned, his heart pounding. The moment had passed. Cole's eyes locked onto his, and for a fleeting second, there was a silent understanding between them. Two men caught in a system neither could escape. Ethan made his choice. Ethan's grip tightened on the gun, his pulse pounding in his ears as he turned to face the woman who had just entered the room. Her presence in the doorway was commanding, like a final force pulling him back to reality. The weight of the decision still hung heavily in the air, and Cole's eyes were still on him, watching, waiting, as if he could somehow peer into Ethan's soul and see the battle taking place within. The woman didn't look at Cole. Her focus was entirely on Ethan, her eyes cold and calculating. "It's time," she repeated, her voice sharp like a knife. "The mission is complete. We've been monitoring you, Ethan. You've made your choice. You're one of us now." Ethan stood frozen, the gun in his hand now feeling like a foreign object. It was as though the room had tilted, the ground beneath him shifting with a weight he couldn't fully understand. How had he ended up here? A few months ago, he had been an ordinary man, working an ordinary job. Now he was standing on the precipice of something much darker. Cole, still standing at his desk, spoke again. "You don't have to do this. Whatever they told you, Ethan. Whatever lies they fed you. It's not too late to walk away. You don't have to be part of their twisted game." Ethan's mind raced. His fingers hovered over the trigger. And yet, the words were there. "It's not too late." Pounding in his head like a drumbeat, he could walk away, couldn't he? He could turn the gun away and end this. Just walk out of this place and forget everything he had learned. He could take his chances, flee, and leave the shadows behind. But the woman's voice cut through his thoughts, bringing him back to the cold reality. "You have no choice, Ethan. You're already involved. You've crossed the line. You're part of this system. There's no going back." The room felt like it was closing in on him, suffocating him with the weight of his options. He couldn't even bring himself to look at Cole now. How had things become so complicated? One simple choice, the easiest thing to do in the world, now felt like the hardest. "Do you want to be free?" Cole asked, his voice gentle now, almost pleading. "You're not trapped, not yet. But if you do this, if you take that step, you're part of their system forever." Ethan's mind was in turmoil. The voices of the woman and Cole were battling inside his head. The organization had always been clear: complete the mission, eliminate the target, and the rewards would follow. But in that moment, standing in Cole's office, everything Ethan had been told, everything he had been made to believe, seemed to shatter into pieces. Was this really the life he wanted? To be an instrument of destruction for a group that didn't care about right or wrong? Ethan slowly lowered the gun, his eyes locked on the floor. He felt as though he was sinking deeper into the abyss, every move pulling him further away from who he used to be. But he couldn't do it. He couldn't follow through on the task, not when the consequences of his actions felt so clear, so irrevocable. The woman stepped forward, her voice icy. "You're making a mistake, Ethan. This isn't just about you. This is about something bigger than any one person. This is about ensuring the system remains in control. If you walk away now, you'll lose everything. You'll be nothing." Ethan clenched his fists, trying to steady himself. "Is this who I am now?" he asked himself. He had been following orders for so long, had done things he'd never imagined he would. But this felt different. This felt personal. "I'm not a part of this anymore," Ethan said, his voice finally steady, though his heart was still racing. He was ready to walk away from it all, even if it meant the unknown. The woman's eyes hardened. "You can't just walk away. Do you think they'll let you? Do you think anyone will just forget what you've done?" She turned to Cole, her gaze cold. "He's your responsibility now. Get him out of here." Ethan's heart sank. There was no going back now. He knew the woman wasn't just making a threat. He was a liability, and once someone was labeled a liability, there was no way out. But as she turned, Cole took a step forward, his eyes never leaving Ethan's. "I told you," he said softly. "You're not trapped yet. You still have a chance to make the right choice. Come with me, and we can expose them. We can take them down together." Ethan felt the weight of Cole's words hit him like a tidal wave. The possibility of redemption, the idea that he could still make a difference, it felt both liberating and terrifying. He had the chance to walk away from the system he had joined, to tear it down, to take everything down with him. But was he strong enough to take that step? The woman turned back toward him, her voice stern. "You don't understand, Ethan. You've already made your choice, and now you're ours. If you think you can escape, you're gravely mistaken. We've been watching you long enough to know everything about you. Don't make this harder on yourself." Ethan looked back at Cole. For a brief moment, their gazes locked. Two men standing at a crossroads, their fates intertwined. He could feel it in his bones that this was the moment that would define him. "Make the right choice," Cole's eyes seemed to say. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. He didn't want to be a part of the system anymore. He didn't want to be the one pulling the strings, making people disappear for nothing more than a game of power. But what was he supposed to do? Leave and risk being erased? Or stay and risk losing himself in the process? With a deep breath, he made his decision. "I'm done," Ethan said, his voice firm. "I won't be part of this anymore." The woman's expression darkened. "You don't get to make that choice." Before she could take another step toward him, Ethan turned and bolted for the door. His heart raced as he ran. His mind set on only one thing: escape. He didn't know where he was going, but he couldn't stay. He couldn't be a part of this world any longer. The sound of footsteps behind him grew louder, but he didn't look back. He had crossed the line once, but now he was choosing to cross it in the opposite direction. He was choosing his freedom, no matter the cost. As Ethan burst out of the building and into the night, he knew there was no going back now. He had made his choice, and the consequences would follow. But for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Ethan ran through the darkened streets, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he pushed his legs to their limit. The city was still, the occasional car passing by, oblivious to the chaos unfolding just beneath the surface. His mind raced as he thought about his next move. He couldn't afford to slow down. He had made his choice, but he knew it wouldn't be long before the organization came after him. They didn't tolerate defiance, and Ethan had just given them the ultimate betrayal. He glanced over his shoulder, his heart pounding as he expected to see the woman, or worse, the men in suits who had been his handlers. But there was no one. Not yet. He wasn't sure if it was his fear or his instincts telling him to run, but he didn't want to take any chances. Ethan turned down an alley, his footsteps echoing against the cold concrete. He didn't know where he was going, didn't know how he would survive, but he had to get away. He couldn't stay in the city, not when the organization had its eyes on him. He needed to disappear. He needed to vanish, to erase every trace of himself. A few blocks ahead, he saw a bus stop. There was a bus arriving soon, and he realized that it could be his ticket out. He could hop on, blend in with the few tired commuters, and slip away into the night. He didn't have a destination in mind. just a need to get as far from this place as possible. He had always been good at keeping his distance from people, but now, for the first time in his life, he needed to disappear completely. Ethan slowed his pace as the bus pulled up, the doors creaking open. He stepped inside, paying his fare with the last of his cash. He didn't even check the route. He just wanted to get out. Anywhere was better than staying put. The bus doors closed behind him, sealing him in a world that, for the moment, felt safer than the one he had just left. The bus started moving, its headlights cutting through the darkness of the city streets. Ethan settled into a seat near the back, trying to blend into the shadows. He leaned his head against the window, watching the city fade into the distance. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one louder than the last. Had he made the right choice? Could he truly outrun the people who controlled his life? He had seen what they were capable of, their power, their reach. The organization was a shadow that stretched far beyond the city, beyond anything Ethan could comprehend. He had already crossed the line once, and now it seemed that there was no way to step back over it. As the bus moved through the quiet streets, Ethan couldn't help but think about Daniel Cole, the man who had given him a glimpse of the truth, a man who had asked Ethan to make the right choice. He had been offered a chance to walk away, and for the first time, Ethan had taken it. But at what cost? He closed his eyes, trying to block out the noise in his head. The sound of the engine, the hum of the wheels on the road, the distant chatter of the other passengers. It was all too much. It wasn't just about running anymore. It was about survival. It was about protecting the little bit of freedom he had left. The bus turned onto a deserted highway, and Ethan's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden jolt. He opened his eyes to find that the bus had come to a stop. The driver had pulled over to the side of the road, and Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. Something wasn't right. He leaned forward, trying to see what was going on. There was no one else on the street, just the empty road stretching into the darkness. And then, as if on cue, he heard the unmistakable sound of a car approaching. It was too late to get off the bus now. Ethan sat back in his seat, trying to steady his breathing. He was being watched. He could feel it. The car slowed as it came alongside the bus, its headlights blinding through the window. It stopped just beside the vehicle, and Ethan's stomach dropped. The woman's figure appeared in the driver's side window, her cold eyes piercing the darkness. She smiled, but it wasn't a smile of reassurance. It was the smile of someone who knew they had already won. "Get off the bus, Ethan," she said, her voice smooth, calm. "It's over." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He knew that voice. He knew those eyes. And he knew there was no point in running any longer. The organization had found him. The bus doors opened, and he could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him. He stood slowly, his legs trembling. He had hoped to escape. He had hoped to outrun them. But now, as he stepped off the bus and into the cold night air, he realized that his fate had already been sealed. The woman was waiting for him. "You've made your choice, Ethan," she said, stepping out of the car. "Now you'll live with the consequences." Ethan didn't resist as the men in black suits moved toward him, surrounding him on all sides. He had fought long enough. He had run. He had hidden. And now he had nowhere left to go. But in the silence that followed, as he was led back toward the car, one thing became clear. He had chosen freedom. And while the organization might have found him, they couldn't take that from him. Not yet. The cold night air felt sharp against Ethan's skin as the car door slammed shut behind him. He sat in the back seat, surrounded by the same cold silence that had haunted him ever since he'd crossed that line. The woman, sitting in the passenger seat, glanced over her shoulder at him, her gaze sharp and calculating. "You thought you could run," she said softly, as though speaking to a child who had been caught misbehaving. "Did you really think it would be that easy? To just walk away from everything?" Ethan stared straight ahead, his mind still racing. His body was tense, the reality of what had just happened sinking in with every passing second. He'd been caught. There was no way out now. The organization's grip on him was stronger than ever. He'd chosen to break free, but in doing so, he'd only made himself a target. The car moved through the streets, the sound of the tires on asphalt, the only noise that filled the space. Ethan glanced out the window, his mind desperately searching for a way to escape this situation. But the city seemed to swallow him whole, the streets stretching endlessly into the dark, as if there was no escaping the reach of the organization. "We've been monitoring you," the woman continued, her voice cool and detached. "Everything you've done, everything you've seen. You can't hide from us. We know who you are, what you've done. And now you're ours. You'll never be free again." Ethan clenched his fists, a cold anger rising within him. He wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He couldn't let them win. There had to be a way to take control of this situation, to find a way out of their grasp. He had seen too much, learned too much to just submit to their control. "What are you going to do with me?" Ethan asked, his voice a low growl, his frustration boiling over. The woman turned her head, her lips curling into a slight smile. Oh, Ethan, we're not going to do anything. You've already done it to yourself. You've crossed the line. The choices you've made brought you here. You just didn't understand the consequences." Ethan's mind flashed back to the files on Project Chronos, the ability to manipulate time itself, the organization's experiments with rewriting history. It felt like a nightmare, one that he couldn't escape. But even now, as they drove him deeper into the unknown, there was a small part of him that refused to believe it was over. "I'm not going to be your puppet," Ethan muttered under his breath. The woman's eyes flicked toward him in the rearview mirror, her expression unreadable. "You're not the first to say that. But you will learn, Ethan. You'll learn what happens when you play with forces that are beyond your control. The things you thought were possible, the things you thought you could escape from, they're all part of the bigger picture. And whether you want to or not, you're a part of it now." Ethan didn't say anything. There were no words left. His options were limited, his fate sealed. All he could do was wait and watch as the car continued down the road, taking him deeper into the heart of the organization's power. Eventually, the car stopped in front of a large, nondescript building, the kind of place that blended in with the city, hidden in plain sight. The woman opened the door, her heels clicking against the pavement. Ethan was about to step out when one of the men in black suits grabbed his arm, forcing him to walk ahead of them. "You'll learn quickly that there's no escape," the woman said as she led him toward the building. "No matter how far you run, no matter what you do, you'll always be a part of this system. It's in your blood now. You're one of us." Ethan felt a sickening pang in his stomach, the truth of her words settling deep inside him. One of us. That was what they had always said to the people who became too important to the organization. He wasn't just an agent anymore. He was a tool, a piece of something much bigger, a system designed to control and shape the world, and Ethan had become an unwitting cog in its gears. They reached the entrance of the building. The woman held the door open for him, motioning for him to enter. Ethan hesitated, but the grip on his arm tightened, and he had no choice but to comply. Inside, the building was cold and sterile, the walls lined with metal doors and security panels. It looked like a facility built to house secrets, dark, hidden, and designed to keep everything under control. The woman led him down a long hallway, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor. There were no windows, no signs of life, just the hum of distant machinery, the faint sound of voices echoing from the halls. Ethan's heart was pounding in his chest. He had no idea what awaited him here. But something told him that whatever it was, it would be worse than anything he had already encountered. He had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. They stopped in front of a door at the end of the hall. The woman turned to face him. Her gaze was cold, calculating, but there was something else there now. A flicker of something that could almost be described as pity. "You'll be given a choice," she said, her voice steady. "It's time to decide whether you want to be part of the system you've spent so long running from, or if you'll choose to be erased. There is no middle ground, Ethan. Choose wisely." With that, she opened the door, and Ethan stepped inside. The door clicked shut behind Ethan with a soft thud, and the room went dark for a moment. He blinked, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. The walls were bare, except for a single chair in the center of the room. The air was thick with tension, every inch of the space seeming to pulse with an energy that Ethan couldn't fully comprehend. It was like being inside the belly of a beast, cold, silent, and watching him with unblinking eyes. As the last of the ambient light flickered on, he saw the figure waiting for him. Dr. Benjamin Ward, the mastermind behind everything. He sat at a desk, his back to Ethan, but Ethan could tell by the rigidness of his posture that the man was aware of his presence. "Ah, Mr. Hayes," Ward's voice cut through the silence, deep and commanding. "You've made quite an impression on the organization, haven't you?" Ethan stood frozen in place. This was it. This was the man behind the operation. The man whose research had birthed Project Chronos, whose ambitions had sent ripples through time itself. This was the man who had manipulated him, played him like a puppet on strings, and now Ethan was face to face with him. He hadn't expected the encounter to be this disorienting. Ward was sitting calmly in front of him, like a king who knew his reign would never end, his fingers lightly tapping on the desk. Ethan's hand twitched toward his side, his body instinctively reaching for the gun still tucked into his jacket. But he stopped himself. It was pointless. Ward didn't seem to need protection. He wasn't afraid of Ethan. He never had been. "You should be proud of yourself, Ethan," Ward continued, his voice laced with a strange mix of admiration and something colder. "You've done what few others could. You've come this far, outwitting, surviving, even deceiving the very people who trained you. But it doesn't end here. Not yet." Ward turned to face him, and Ethan was struck by the intensity in his eyes. They were sharp, calculating, as if Ward had already planned every possible outcome to the situation. Every step, every move, had been orchestrated. Nothing was left to chance. "You've crossed a line, but you still have a choice," Ward said, his gaze never wavering. "You can continue to resist, live as a fugitive, running for the rest of your life. Or you can embrace your place in the system you've been a part of from the very beginning. The choice is yours, but I warn you, whatever path you take will have consequences." Ethan's breath hitched. The idea of joining them, of becoming a part of this monstrous system, seemed impossible to him now. The truth he had uncovered, Project Chronos, the manipulation of time, the rewriting of history, it was all too much. And now, Ward was offering him a way in, a place where he could belong, a place where he could become part of the very machine that controlled everything. Was this really what Ethan wanted? "You've seen the files," Ward continued, watching Ethan closely. "You know the power we have, the power to control time, to shape history. You know that what we do is necessary. And now, you have a choice. You can either remain an outsider, forever running from us, or you can take your rightful place among the few who understand the true nature of power." Ethan's mind raced, the weight of his decision suffocating him. He had been a part of this system for so long, trapped in the web of lies, deception, and manipulation. The idea of joining Ward, of becoming a part of something so vast, so powerful, was terrifying. But there was a part of him, a part he couldn't deny, that wanted to understand it fully, to be part of something bigger than himself. "What do you want from me, Ward?" Ethan's voice was hoarse, his resolve weakening. What is it that you want me to do? Ward's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a reassuring smile. It was a smile of someone who had already won. I want you to see the truth, Ethan. I want you to stop resisting and understand the role you were always meant to play. You have the knowledge, the experience. You've seen the world for what it is. Now, take control of it. Join me, and together, we can reshape history. For a moment, the room felt like it was spinning. Ethan's mind reeled, trying to process everything he had just heard. His thoughts clashed, one side urging him to refuse, to run, to keep fighting. But another side, a darker, more cynical part of him, wondered whether this was his chance to escape the endless chase, to finally understand the depths of power, to stop being a pawn and become the one who pulled the strings. Ward stood slowly, walking toward Ethan. He was close now, so close that Ethan could feel the weight of his gaze on him. You've already seen what happens when you resist, Ethan. The consequences are severe. But imagine what we could accomplish together. Imagine a world where you have the power to change anything, reshape anything, just by shifting the timeline. The possibilities are endless. Ethan swallowed hard, his heart racing. The idea was tempting. More than tempting. It was seductive. What if he could change things? What if he could undo mistakes, rewrite history, and become someone powerful? The thought consumed him, eating away at the last remnants of his hesitation. But deep down, Ethan knew he couldn't become one of them. He couldn't be a part of this corrupt, twisted system. He had seen too much. The manipulation, the lives destroyed, the lies hidden beneath the veil of power. He couldn't, he wouldn't become a tool for them. No, Ethan said finally, his voice steady, though his hands clenched into fists at his sides. I won't be a part of this. Not anymore. Ward's smile faltered for the briefest of moments, but it quickly returned, more controlled than before. So be it, Ethan. But know this. There is no escape from us. You will never be free. As Ethan turned to leave, he felt Ward's eyes on his back, heavy with the weight of an unspoken promise. There is no escape. But Ethan wasn't listening anymore. He had made his choice. The door opened, and as he stepped into the hall, he was met with the cold reality of the world he had left behind. The system wasn't done with him yet, but he was determined not to let it define him. Ethan walked down the narrow corridor, his footsteps echoing off the cold, sterile walls. The tension in the air was thick, like the building itself was holding its breath. He could feel the weight of Ward's words pressing down on him, the promise of power and control lingering like a shadow over everything he did. But he had made his choice, and there was no turning back now. He refused to be part of their twisted machine. As he reached the end of the hallway, a door opened, and two men in black suits stepped out. Their cold eyes locked onto Ethan immediately, as though they had been expecting him. Their expressions were unreadable, but there was a palpable sense of danger in the air. Ethan had no illusions. He knew they were part of the same organization that had been pulling the strings all along. Ethan Hayes, one of the men said, his voice low and calculated. You're making a mistake. Ethan didn't respond. He couldn't afford to. His mind was focused entirely on the task at hand, getting out of this place, away from the grasp of the organization. But even as he stood there trying to remain calm, he knew that escape wasn't going to be easy. They were too powerful, too connected. They would come after him no matter where he went. Do you think you can just walk away? The other man asked, stepping closer. You're in deeper than you realize. You've seen too much. There's no place for you in the world you're trying to return to. Ethan's fingers twitched at his side, itching for the gun he had hidden beneath his jacket. He had no idea if he would be able to take them on, but he wasn't going to stand here and be taken without a fight. He had already made the decision to break free. If they were going to come after him, they would have to do it on his terms. "I'm not a part of your system anymore," Ethan said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "And I'm not going to let you control me." The men exchanged glances, their expressions tight. They clearly weren't expecting this kind of defiance. But it didn't matter. They were here for one purpose: to bring him back into the fold, to force him to comply with the organization's will. Ethan was beginning to realize just how deep their reach truly went. "You don't understand, do you?" the first man said. "You can't just walk away from this. Not after everything you've seen, not after the work you've done for us. You belong to the system now, and there's no going back." Ethan shook his head. "You've been watching me for too long, but you haven't been watching closely enough." Before the men could react, Ethan turned and bolted down the corridor. His mind was focused, his legs moving faster than he thought possible. He didn't know where he was going, didn't know how he was going to escape, but he knew that he couldn't stand there and let them drag him back into their world. The pounding of his heart drowned out the sound of the men's footsteps behind him as they began to chase him. He reached the end of the hall and burst through a door, finding himself in a large, open space. The ceiling was high, the floor smooth concrete. There were machines everywhere, advanced technology, machinery that hummed with energy. It looked like something out of a science fiction movie, and for a split second, Ethan's mind raced as he realized just how much power the organization controlled. But there was no time to think. He could hear the footsteps of the men approaching, growing louder by the second. The sound of their boots against the concrete floor was like a countdown. He needed to get out. Ethan glanced around quickly, searching for an exit. There, at the far end of the room, a metal door. He didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward it, ignoring the pain in his side, his legs burning with every step. As he reached the door, his hand fumbled for the handle, panic setting in as he tried to escape before they could catch up to him. The door opened with a creak, and he rushed through, finding himself outside in a dimly lit alleyway. The cold night air hit him like a slap in the face, and he didn't look back. He ran. For what felt like hours, Ethan ran through the darkened streets, weaving through alleys, dodging people, trying to put as much distance between himself and the organization as possible. His breath was ragged, his body exhausted, but his mind was focused. He couldn't afford to stop. He couldn't afford to let them catch him. Eventually, he found a small, run-down hotel on the edge of town. It wasn't much, but it would have to do for now. Ethan paid for a room, keeping his head down as he made his way to the door. He didn't trust anyone anymore, not even the people who checked him in. But for a few hours, he needed a place to rest, a place to gather his thoughts. Inside the room, he locked the door and collapsed onto the bed. His mind was spinning, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. He had made it this far, but he knew it wouldn't be long before the organization came for him again. They would never stop hunting him. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the small flash drive, the one that had contained all the files on Project Kronos, on the manipulation of time. The same files that had been the catalyst for everything. The files that had shown him just how deep the organization's reach truly went. He stared at the drive for a long moment, his fingers tracing the edges. The power that was contained within it was immense. It could change everything, but what good was it if he couldn't use it? What good was it if he was on the run for the rest of his life? He had to find a way to expose the truth, to take down the system that had controlled him for so long. But in order to do that, he would need help. He would need allies, and Ethan knew that finding them would be harder than he could imagine. He stared at the ceiling, his mind racing with plans and possibilities. He had made his choice, and now it was time to fight for his freedom. There was no turning back. And if he wanted to survive, if he wanted to see this through, he would have to face the full force of the organization and everything they would do to silence him. But Ethan wasn't ready to give up, not yet. The next few days passed in a blur. Ethan stayed holed up in the hotel, moving only when absolutely necessary, always careful, always watching. Every time he stepped outside, he felt the weight of the organization's gaze on him, like 1,000 eyes were watching his every move. The city, once familiar and ordinary, now felt like a prison, a vast, concrete labyrinth with no escape. He spent most of his time researching, trying to piece together the knowledge he had gained about Project Kronos and the organization behind it. The flash drive in his pocket felt heavier than it ever had before. Its contents were a ticking time bomb. The data it held could expose everything, but it wasn't enough. Not on its own. He needed more. As Ethan sat hunched over his laptop in the dimly lit room, he combed through the files, searching for any hint of weakness, any detail that could help him take down the organization. The deeper he dug, the more he realized just how deeply rooted they were. This wasn't just a shadowy group operating in the dark. This was the system. Every government, every powerful institution was involved in some way. But even in the vast web of corruption and control, there were cracks. Ethan could feel them, faint but unmistakable. If he could find the right leverage, the right pieces, he could exploit them. It wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way forward. He needed help. The question gnawed at him constantly. Who could he trust? He had burned every bridge with the people he once knew. His old contacts were either too far gone or too scared to take a stand. The organization had eyes everywhere, and anyone close to him would be in danger. But there was one name that had been drifting in and out of his thoughts for days now. Daniel Cole. The journalist had been a thorn in the organization's side for years, digging into the same files that Ethan had uncovered. Cole knew too much about Project Kronos. He had been on the verge of exposing it all when Ethan had been sent to eliminate him. But Cole had survived, and if anyone could help Ethan now, it was him. Ethan knew it was a risk. If the organization had already targeted him, they would be keeping tabs on Cole as well. But he didn't have a choice. He needed to make contact. He needed answers, and Cole was the one person who might have them. He sat up, pushing his laptop aside. There was no time to waste. Ethan grabbed the flash drive from his jacket pocket, slipped it into his bag, and stood. As he prepared to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. Every time he looked over his shoulder, he expected to see the men in black suits, the ones who had been hunting him since the moment he walked away from the organization. But he couldn't afford to wait any longer. He had a lead. The meeting spot was an old diner on the edge of town, far enough from the city center to be forgotten, but close enough for anyone desperate enough to find it. Ethan had arranged the meeting through a secure channel, careful to avoid leaving any trace. As he sat in a booth at the back of the diner, he could feel the tension in his chest rise. This could be the moment he had been waiting for, or it could be the moment he was caught. The bell above the door jingled, and Ethan's gaze shot up. A man in his mid-40s entered, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Ethan. Daniel Cole. Ethan didn't move, just watched as Cole made his way toward the booth. The journalist was older than he remembered, his face lined with stress and exhaustion, but his eyes were still sharp, still burning with the same relentless pursuit of truth. "You look like hell," Cole said as he slid into the seat across from Ethan. Ethan chuckled darkly. "You don't look so great yourself." Cole studied him for a moment, then nodded toward the bag at Ethan's side. "You brought it, I see." Ethan didn't hesitate. He pulled the flash drive from his bag and placed it on the table between them. "I need your help, Cole. You're the only one who knows what's really going on. I can't do this alone." Cole's eyes flicked to the flash drive, and for a brief moment, he didn't speak. Then, finally, he met Ethan's gaze. "You've seen it, haven't you? The truth about Project Kronos, about the people behind it." Ethan nodded. "I've seen enough to know that everything I thought I knew about the world was a lie." Cole leaned back in his seat, his fingers drumming on the edge of the table. "I've been trying to expose it for years, but they've covered their tracks so well. Every time I get close, every time I think I'm about to crack it open, they pull me back. They silence anyone who gets too close. But you, Ethan, you were on the inside. You can get us the answers." Ethan shook his head. "I was on the inside, but I was just a pawn, a tool for them. And now that I've walked away, they'll come after me. They'll come after you too." Cole's eyes narrowed. "They don't scare me." Ethan met his gaze. "They should." There was a long pause as the weight of their words hung in the air. The sound of clinking silverware and low conversation from other patrons seemed distant, almost irrelevant to the gravity of the moment. Cole leaned forward, his voice low. "We use the data from the flash drive, all of it. We release it to the world, let everyone see the truth. We can't stop them alone, but if we make enough noise, if we put enough pressure on them, maybe we can break the system from the inside." Cole's eyes glinted with a mix of excitement and caution. "That's a hell of a plan, and it's dangerous as hell." Ethan nodded. "It's the only way." Cole sat back, considering the proposition. After a long moment, he finally spoke. "All right, I'll help you. But we'll need more than just the files. We'll need leverage. We need to expose their dirty work, make it undeniable. The people running Project Kronos are untouchable, but they've made mistakes, and we'll find them." Ethan didn't flinch. "We'll find them." As Ethan and Cole exchanged glances, a plan began to take shape between them. They both knew the risks. The organization had eyes everywhere, and exposing them would be like lighting a match in the middle of a powder keg. But it was the only chance they had. Cole reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn notebook. He slid it across the table to Ethan, who opened it carefully, flipping through the pages. The contents were cryptic, full of scribbled notes, names, dates, and locations. It looked like the kind of journal a man would keep when he was working on something dangerous and needed to keep track of everything meticulously. But there was something about the notes that caught Ethan's attention. A pattern, a code he could almost recognize. "I've been collecting everything I can find," Cole said, his voice low. "Contacts, leads, people who have disappeared, the unsolved cases. There's a connection between all of them. Project Kronos. The government's been covering it up for decades, and not just the US. It's international. They've been manipulating time for more than just the personal gain of a few powerful people." Ethan's pulse quickened. He had known that Project Kronos wasn't just a random experiment. The idea that the organization had been using time as a weapon, changing history to their advantage, was even more terrifying than he had imagined. "So, where do we start?" Ethan asked, feeling a new surge of determination. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but they were still scattered. He needed more information, more solid evidence to bring the truth to light. Cole glanced around the diner one more time before answering. "There's a woman, Dr. Claudia Herrera. She's one of the original researchers behind the project. She disappeared a few months ago, but I've been tracking her. She left behind a trail. If we can find her, we can get the full scope of what they've been doing. And if we're lucky, we might even find a way to take them down." Ethan nodded, a plan already forming in his mind. "Where do we start looking for her?" Cole opened the notebook again, flipping to a page with a set of coordinates written down. "These are her last known locations. She's been bouncing between safe houses, but they're all tied to government contractors. We'll need to dig into that." "Sounds like a lot of dead ends," Ethan muttered. "But it's a start." Cole smirked, his usual bravado slipping into place. "You're not wrong, but I've been at this for years. I've been going through the back channels, reaching out to people in the shadows. If there's anyone who knows how to stay hidden, it's her. And she might just have the answers we need." Ethan closed the notebook, the weight of the task ahead settling heavily on his shoulders. He was already neck-deep in a world of secrets and shadows, But this was different. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about tearing down the system itself, exposing the lies that had controlled everything for so long. "There's one thing I don't get," Ethan said, looking at Cole with a furrowed brow. "Why help me? You could have walked away a long time ago. You could have let them handle me. So why now?" Cole leaned back, eyes gleaming with a mixture of frustration and resolve. "Because I'm not just doing this for you, Ethan. I'm doing this for the people they've erased, for the ones they've changed, rewritten. Project Kronos isn't just about power, it's about control. And people like you and me, we're nothing but pawns to them." Ethan's eyes darkened. "I get it." They were both trapped in the same game, but with a common goal now: to bring down the people who had controlled their lives, to expose the lies, and to end the manipulation of time once and for all. The next few days were a blur of preparations, research, and planning. Ethan and Cole worked tirelessly, digging through databases, hacking into old files, and making connections that neither of them thought were possible. Every lead they followed only opened up a deeper rabbit hole. The organization was everywhere, with fingers in every aspect of global power, but the deeper they dug, the clearer it became. The truth was out there. They had tracked Dr. Claudia Herrera's trail to a small, unassuming town on the outskirts of a forgotten military base. It wasn't much, but it was their only lead. Ethan had no illusions that it would be easy, but he was ready. They both were. The night they arrived in the town, it felt eerily quiet, as if everyone knew something was coming. The buildings were old, some abandoned, and the streets were barely lit. They had found a small motel to stay in, a place where they could keep a low profile while they gathered intel. Cole was already on the phone with an old contact who had managed to get a brief glimpse of Dr. Herrera before she vanished. Ethan paced the small room, trying to keep his nerves under control. This was it. They were so close. "There's a diner on the edge of town," Cole said, hanging up the phone. "One of Herrera's old colleagues works there. We meet her tomorrow. If she's willing to talk, we might have the breakthrough we need." Ethan nodded. His mind was racing, but there was something in the air, something that didn't sit right with him. The deeper they went, the more he felt the eyes of the organization on them, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the moment to strike. "Get some sleep," Cole added, reading Ethan's unease. "We need to be sharp tomorrow." But sleep didn't come easily for Ethan. As he lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. They had been playing in the shadows for too long, and soon, the organization would stop hiding. Soon, they would come for him, and for Cole, and when they did, there would be no going back. The next morning came far too quickly for Ethan. The hotel room was stifling, and the faint hum of the old air conditioning unit did nothing to soothe his nerves. He dressed quickly, the weight of the flash drive in his jacket pocket still feeling like a constant reminder of the dangerous path he had chosen. Cole was already up, pacing back and forth, running through the details of their plan for the day. "You ready?" Cole asked, glancing at Ethan as he adjusted his jacket. Ethan nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure if he was. "Let's just hope this contact knows what she's talking about." The town was small, almost too quiet, as they made their way through the empty streets. The diner Cole had mentioned was tucked away at the corner of a desolate intersection. It had an old neon sign that buzzed faintly above the door, and the windows were smudged with years of grime. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though there was no one around. The air seemed heavy, oppressive, and as they entered the diner, the bell over the door chimed too loudly in the silence. Inside, the atmosphere was exactly what they had expected. A throwback to a simpler time, with retro booths and chipped counters. But the woman behind the counter wasn't exactly what they had expected. She was older than Cole had described, but her eyes were sharp and calculating, her demeanor calm and deliberate. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" she asked, her voice low and steady as she wiped down a cup with a rag. Cole wasted no time. We're looking for someone. Dr. Claudia Herrera. You know her? The woman's expression didn't change, but her hand paused mid-wipe. It was subtle, but Ethan noticed. She knew something. Maybe, she said finally, but you'll have to be more specific. Ethan felt his pulse quicken, but he kept his voice steady. We know she's been hiding here. She worked on Project Kronos. We need to talk to her. She has information we need. The woman glanced over at the window, her eyes scanning the street outside before locking back onto Cole. This isn't the place for that conversation, she said, her voice lowered. You'll find her, but it won't be easy. No one comes back after getting involved with that project. People like her. They don't just disappear for nothing. You have no idea what you're getting into. Ethan felt the tension in the air thickening. It was like a dam ready to break. The woman was giving them something, but it wasn't enough. She was testing them. We need to find her, Cole insisted, leaning in slightly. We know she was working on the project to manipulate time, and we're not backing down. The woman studied them for a long moment before nodding slightly. Fine, she said. There's a barn just outside of town near the old railway tracks. Don't let anyone see you. There's a door on the side of the barn. That's where you'll find her. Ethan nodded, his mind already processing the information. Thank you. Without another word, they left the diner, the woman's gaze following them as they stepped back into the street. As they reached the corner, Ethan turned to Cole. Why do I have a bad feeling about this? Cole didn't look at him. Because it's too easy. Too convenient. But we have no choice. The old barn wasn't far from the diner, and they didn't waste any time getting there. As they approached, Ethan felt a sense of unease growing in the pit of his stomach. The barn looked abandoned, its wooden planks weathered and cracked, but it was the kind of place people used to hide in plain sight. No one would ever think to look here, which was exactly why Dr. Claudia Herrera had chosen it. The barn creaked as they reached the side door, which was half open. Ethan motioned for Cole to stay behind him, and he stepped inside first. The air inside was thick with dust, the smell of hay and old wood lingering in the stale atmosphere. Their footsteps echoed through the empty space, but there was no sign of anyone. Claudia, Cole called out softly, his voice tense. They moved further inside, their eyes scanning the dimly lit interior. The only sound was the soft creak of the barn as the wind passed through the cracks in the walls. Ethan's instincts were on high alert, his every sense focused on the shadows. He could feel it, the presence of something just out of reach. Suddenly there was a noise, a faint rustling, like footsteps in the distance. Ethan froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun hidden under his jacket. He motioned for Cole to stay quiet, and they both crept forward, the tension in the air palpable. Then a voice broke through the silence. I thought I might find you here. Ethan whirled around, his heart racing. Standing in the doorway, bathed in the dim light filtering through the cracks in the barn, was Dr. Claudia Herrera. She looked different than Ethan expected. Disheveled, tired, but unmistakably alive. The woman who had been working on the very project that had brought them all together. I didn't think anyone would come looking for me, she said, her voice cool but tinged with something else, something darker. You've already seen what the organization is capable of, haven't you? Ethan didn't respond immediately. He didn't know what to say. Her presence, the fact that she was still alive, was both a relief and a reminder of how deep this all went. We need to talk, Ethan said, his voice strained. You have the answers we need, about Project Kronos, about the timeline manipulation. We need to know everything. Dr. Herrera's eyes narrowed, but there was no fear in them. Instead, there was something else. A knowing, almost as if she had been expecting this moment for a long time. She stepped into the barn fully, closing the door behind her with a quiet thud. "I've been running from them for years," she said softly. "I thought I could get away, but no one can outrun Project Chronos. They control everything, and now they know you're here." Ethan's blood ran cold as the words sank in. "What are you talking about? We came here to end this." Dr. Herrera looked at him, a sad smile forming on her lips. "You can't end it, Ethan. The project isn't just about time manipulation. It's about control, about shaping the future. They've already altered the course of history in ways you can't even begin to imagine. And now, they're coming for you." The door to the barn slammed open. The door to the barn burst open with a force that shook the wooden frame. Ethan's heart raced as he instinctively grabbed Cole by the arm, pulling him back into the shadows of the barn. The rush of cold air from outside sent a chill down his spine, and before he could fully process what was happening, figures in black tactical gear flooded the doorway. Dr. Herrera stepped forward, her posture suddenly rigid, as if the sound of their approach had triggered something in her mind. She raised her hand slightly, but it wasn't a gesture of surrender. It was a silent warning. Ethan's grip tightened on his gun, but he didn't draw it yet. He wasn't sure who was on the other side of that door, but one thing was clear. They weren't here to negotiate. A man stepped into the barn, the others flanking him. He was tall, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. But Ethan could see the cold calculation in his eyes. The man wasn't here for answers. He was here to silence them all. "You should have stayed away," the man said, his voice low and unyielding. He turned slightly, signaling the others to spread out and secure the perimeter of the barn. "Dr. Herrera, you've made a mistake by involving them." Ethan's mind raced. The organization had found them. He could feel the weight of their presence, like a storm about to break. He had known it was only a matter of time before they came for him, but he hadn't expected them to track him here, so quickly, so decisively. Dr. Herrera didn't flinch at the man's words. Her face was hard, determined, and for the first time since Ethan had met her, he saw the full extent of her resolve. "I didn't make a mistake. You're the ones who have been playing with fire for too long. You think you can control history, manipulate time, erase and rewrite reality itself." She took a step forward, standing tall. "It's over. I'm done hiding." The man's eyes narrowed, a hint of annoyance flashing across his face. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device. "You never learn, Claudia. You think they'll ever let you go. You're nothing but a tool. You always have been." Ethan's finger twitched on the trigger of his gun. He had seen enough. "You don't get it, do you?" he shouted, stepping out of the shadows. "You've controlled people like us for years, played us like pawns. But we're done. We're taking this down, starting with you." The man's gaze snapped to Ethan, a moment of surprise crossing his features. But before he could react, the rest of the armed operatives shifted, positioning themselves to corner them in the barn. Ethan had seconds. His options were limited, but the one thing he could count on was that the element of surprise was on his side. "Claudia, move!" Ethan shouted. Without another word, he rushed forward, grabbing a metal beam from a pile of discarded farm equipment. With a quick swing, he knocked one of the operatives to the ground. The barn erupted into chaos as Cole followed suit, throwing a chair toward another of the men, momentarily disorienting him. Dr. Herrera wasn't standing idly by. She had already sprinted toward the back of the barn, disappearing behind a stack of crates. Ethan had no idea where she was going, but his instincts told him to follow her. They had to get out. They had to keep moving. The man who had spoken earlier, the leader of the operatives, motioned sharply to the others. "Get them! Now!" Gunfire rang out, the crack of bullets tearing through the air, barely missing Ethan as he dove behind cover. He could hear Cole yelling, his voice filled with adrenaline and fear. But there was no time to think. Ethan's mind was solely focused on finding Dr. Herrera. getting her to safety, and escaping before the rest of the organization closed in. As Ethan crouched behind a stack of old hay bales, he could hear the sound of footsteps getting closer, the metal of weapons scraping against the barn floor. They were too close now. The walls of the barn felt like they were closing in around him. They needed a way out, and fast. Dr. Herrera's voice echoed from the far corner. "There's a tunnel under here. I can lead you to it." Without hesitation, Ethan scrambled to his feet and ran toward her voice, adrenaline coursing through his veins. The door behind him creaked as one of the operatives charged in, but Ethan ignored him, focusing entirely on the faint light in the corner of the barn where Dr. Herrera had disappeared. She was already pulling away some loose floorboards when Ethan reached her, his heart hammering in his chest. "Hurry!" she urged. The sound of heavy boots and shouting rang in his ears. Ethan helped her pull the floorboards aside, revealing a narrow tunnel. It was dark, damp, and smelled of earth, but it was their only option. Without thinking, Ethan grabbed Cole's arm and pulled him into the tunnel. "You lead," Ethan said, his voice harsh with urgency. "We'll cover you." Dr. Herrera didn't hesitate. She moved quickly, her experience in hiding evident in every step she took. As they moved deeper into the tunnel, the sounds of their pursuers faded, but the danger didn't feel any less real. They were running out of time. The tunnel twisted and turned, leading them through underground passages and old sewer systems. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, and every step felt heavier. But there was no turning back now. They had seen too much. They had made their choice. Finally, after what seemed like hours, Dr. Herrera stopped in front of a metal door. She punched in a code and the door creaked open. "Where does this lead?" Ethan asked, his voice hoarse. "Safe house, Doctor," Herrera said, her voice low but steady. "It's the only place they won't find us for a while, but you can't stay here forever. The moment you're out in the open again, they'll be on you. The organization doesn't stop." Ethan nodded. "I don't expect it to be easy, but it's the only way we can take them down. We need to expose everything. Project Kronos, their manipulation of history. We need to make sure the world knows what they've done." "Doctor," Herrera looked at him, her gaze serious. "The truth will tear this world apart, Ethan. Are you ready for that?" Ethan took a deep breath. "It's time for the world to see what's been hidden for too long." The door swung open, and they stepped into the dim light of the safe house, knowing that the real battle was only just beginning. The safe house was a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted in the barn. Inside, everything was calm, too calm. The walls were lined with shelves filled with books, equipment, and papers. The furniture was minimal, functional. No comfort, no warmth. It was clear that Dr. Herrera had been here for a long time, always one step ahead of the people hunting her. Ethan paced back and forth, his mind racing. They were safe, for now. But he knew this wouldn't last. The organization would be closing in, tracking every movement, analyzing every trace they left behind. Time was no longer on their side. They had to act fast, Doctor. Herrera stood by a desk, typing quickly into an old computer. The soft glow of the screen illuminated her face, showing the years of exhaustion and fear that had followed her every step since she first became involved with Project Kronos. Ethan couldn't help but watch her. She was the key to everything. If they were going to stop this project, they needed her knowledge. But it wasn't just about the truth anymore. It was about survival. "You've been on the run for years," Ethan said, his voice breaking the silence. "How did you keep ahead of them?" Dr. Herrera didn't look up as she continued typing. "It wasn't easy. They've been tracking me for a long time. I've had to make a lot of sacrifices, change my identity, disappear for months at a time. But the thing about Project Kronos is that it's not just about time manipulation. It's about control. Control over people, over events. And I've been trying to stop it from the inside." The organization doesn't just want to control the future. They want to rewrite history. The power they have is more dangerous than you can imagine. Ethan stopped pacing, his eyes locked onto her. So, where do we go from here? How do we expose them? We don't have much time. Dr. Herrera finally turned away from the computer, her eyes hard with resolve. We need to get to the heart of it, the central hub where Project Kronos is being operated. They've built a facility underground, hidden beneath a major government building. It's not just a lab, it's a whole complex where they manipulate the timelines, where they erase history and rewrite it. That's where they're keeping the most crucial data, the last pieces of the puzzle. Underground? Cole asked, his voice laced with disbelief. You're telling me they're running this whole thing beneath a government building? How is that even possible? Dr. Herrera nodded, her face grim. They've been working on this for decades. They have connections everywhere. Military, intelligence agencies, even corporate giants. The building in question is an old military facility that was repurposed years ago, hidden under layers of security. But I've been there. I know the layout. It's our best shot at bringing this all to light. Ethan's heart raced. It sounded impossible, breaking into a high-security facility, exposing an operation like this. But he had no choice. This was their chance to end it all. The consequences of failure were too high. When do we go? He asked. Dr. Herrera took a deep breath. Tonight, we'll need to move quickly. Get in and out before they even realize we're there. The longer we wait, the more they can track us. Ethan looked at Cole, who gave a tight nod. Let's do it. We're not walking away from this. The plan was set. But as the hours passed, the feeling of being watched never left them. They had to keep their movements stealthy, and every decision carried the weight of their survival. The organization had eyes everywhere, and Ethan knew that any mistake would cost them dearly. By the time nightfall came, they were already on the move. Dr. Herrera had provided them with the necessary tools to bypass security, a series of codes, and a map of the underground complex. They moved swiftly through the dark streets, every corner they turned seemingly leading them deeper into danger. When they finally arrived at the facility, it was eerily quiet. The building loomed ahead, its imposing structure giving off an almost unnatural stillness. They slipped inside through a side door, concealed by shadows and the thick darkness of the night. Ethan could feel his pulse pounding in his ears as they made their way down the corridors. The walls were cold, sterile, and lifeless. The only sound was the soft scrape of their boots against the concrete floor. They passed through several security doors, each one bypassed with expert precision by Dr. Herrera, who had obviously studied this place for years. Finally, they reached the elevator that would take them down to the heart of the facility. As they descended, the tension mounted with every passing floor. This was it, the moment they had been working toward. The stakes couldn't be higher. When the doors opened, they were greeted with a dimly lit hallway that stretched out before them. At the end of the corridor, they could see a large metal door, the entrance to the heart of Project Kronos. Get ready, Dr. Herrera whispered, her voice tight with urgency. Ethan nodded, his hand resting on the handle of his gun. They had no idea what they would find on the other side, but one thing was clear. They couldn't turn back now. The door slid open with a soft hiss, and they stepped into the control room. It was like stepping into another world. Dozens of monitors lined the walls, all flashing with data that moved too quickly to be processed. Screens showed satellite imagery, real-time news updates, and even the locations of various high-profile political figures. This wasn't just an underground facility. It was a command center, monitoring and manipulating the world in ways Ethan had never imagined. In the center of the room, a massive cylindrical chamber hummed with energy. Inside it, a machine, sleek and futuristic, pulsed with a strange blue light. It looked like something out of a science fiction movie, but Ethan knew it was real. The machine was the key to everything, the tool that allowed them to bend time itself. "This is it," Dr. Herrera said, her voice barely a whisper. "This is what they've been using to change the timeline, to control history." Ethan stepped closer, his eyes scanning the room. "How do we stop it?" But before Dr. Herrera could answer, the doors behind them slammed shut. The door slammed shut with a deafening clang, and the dim light of the control room flickered ominously. Ethan's pulse quickened as he turned, instinctively reaching for his gun, his eyes scanning the darkened corridor beyond the door. They were trapped. "Get away from the machine," Dr. Herrera hissed, pushing him back. "We can't let them know we're here yet." But it was too late. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, growing louder by the second. Ethan knew that the organization was moving fast. They'd been waiting for this moment. He motioned for Cole to take cover behind a row of servers while Dr. Herrera ducked behind a console. Ethan crouched low, his heart pounding in his chest as the footsteps grew nearer. Then, the door to the control room slid open once again, and armed figures flooded inside, their presence so overwhelming that the air seemed to pulse with tension. They were wearing black tactical gear, their faces obscured by masks, but there was no mistaking who they were. The very operatives who had hunted Ethan across the country. The very ones who had erased so many lives, who controlled everything from the shadows. At the forefront of the group was the same man who had confronted them in the barn, the one who had led the hunt for Dr. Herrera. His eyes locked onto Ethan, cold and unfeeling. "I should have known you would try something like this," the man said, his voice filled with venom. "You think you can just walk in here and destroy everything we've worked for? You have no idea what you're dealing with." Ethan's grip on his gun tightened, but Dr. Herrera was already moving, stepping in front of him. "It's over. Project Kronos ends tonight." The man's eyes narrowed, but his expression didn't shift. "You've been running from us for years, Claudia. You think this will change anything? You're nothing but a liability." "Not anymore," Dr. Herrera shot back. "We're ending this, whether you like it or not." Before anyone could react, the man raised his hand, signaling his operatives to spread out. The tension in the room became palpable as they circled, their movements calculated, predatory. Ethan's mind raced. There had to be a way out, but he didn't know how much time they had before the situation escalated even further. They needed to act, now. Without warning, Dr. Herrera lunged toward the control panel, pressing a series of buttons in rapid succession. A low hum filled the room, followed by a sudden blinding flash of light from the cylindrical machine. The monitors on the walls flickered wildly, showing scrambled images and broken data. "What the hell did you just do?" the man yelled, his voice now tinged with fear. "Shut it down." But Dr. Herrera only smiled, her eyes wild with the thrill of finally being in control. "I activated the failsafe. The machine is destabilizing. It won't work for much longer." The man's eyes flickered to the machine, now glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. "You've ruined everything," he spat, his voice low and dangerous. "This is your last chance. Surrender now, or we'll take everything from you. You won't walk out of here alive." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, and for the first time in weeks, he felt the full weight of his decision to fight. This wasn't just about them anymore. The entire world was at stake, and if they failed now, it would be the end of everything. He turned to Cole, who was standing behind the servers, his eyes locked onto the operative who had been advancing toward Dr. Herrera. "We need to get to that console," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible over the noise of the destabilizing machine. "We can stop them. We have to." Cole gave a quick nod and moved into position. Ethan followed him, eyes locked on the machine as it flickered again, sending bolts of energy surging through the room. The lights above flickered erratically, casting long shadows across the room. Just as they reached the console, the lead operative turned sharply and raised his weapon. "No more games," he said, a twisted smile forming behind his mask. "You're finished." But before he could fire, a shot rang out from across the room, hitting the man squarely in the shoulder. The force of the impact sent him crashing into the nearest server, sparks flying in every direction. Ethan's eyes snapped to Dr. Herrera, who was holding a gun, her hand steady and her face hard. "No one else is dying today." The operatives hesitated for a moment, clearly stunned, and in that split second, Ethan acted. He dove forward, taking the console from Dr. Herrera's trembling hands and quickly typing in the emergency shutdown code. The screen flickered violently as he entered the final command. "Shut it down," he muttered under his breath. There was a moment of silence as the machine hummed. Then the lights went out completely. And then, the room plunged into darkness. Ethan's heart raced in the absolute stillness. He couldn't hear anything. No footsteps, no movement. Just the sound of his own breathing and the faint, unnatural hum of the machine. He glanced quickly at Dr. Herrera, whose face was bathed in shadow. "What happened?" Cole asked, his voice a mixture of disbelief and urgency. "I don't know," Ethan replied, stepping back cautiously. "The system is down, but I don't think we've seen the end of this yet. There's still a chance they can reboot it. They can't be this vulnerable for long." Just as he finished speaking, the emergency lights flickered on, casting a dim red glow over the room. The operatives who had been surrounding them were gone. "What the hell?" Dr. Herrera muttered, looking around. The sound of footsteps echoed from the corridor again, but this time it was different. The footsteps were slower, more deliberate. Ethan's gut tightened as he turned toward the door. The light above flickered again, casting strange shadows across the walls. "Get to the exit now," Dr. Herrera urged, her voice urgent. "We don't have much time." But before they could move, the man who had led the operatives stepped into the doorway, his hand resting casually on the handle of a large rifle. His face was no longer hidden behind a mask, and this time there was no surprise in his eyes, just cold, ruthless certainty. "You think you've won?" he asked, his voice thick with contempt. "You've barely scratched the surface." The man stepped further into the room, his rifle aimed lazily at Ethan and Cole. His eyes were devoid of emotion, cold, calculating. His presence seemed to absorb the very air in the room, the tension rising with each slow, deliberate step he took. "You're wasting your time," the man said, his voice low, as if speaking to a child. "You think you've exposed us? You think shutting down one machine will stop everything we've built? You're too late. This is bigger than you can ever comprehend." Ethan's grip on his gun tightened, his mind working quickly. This man was confident. Too confident. That meant one of two things. Either they were walking into a trap, or the situation was about to escalate in ways none of them had anticipated. He wasn't about to let this man dictate the terms. "You don't get it, do you?" Ethan said, his voice sharp. "You've been manipulating history, erasing people's lives, controlling entire nations. You've been playing God, and now you're going to lose everything." The man smirked, his eyes narrowing in amusement. "You think you can stop it? The timeline has already been rewritten, Ethan. It's already in motion. You're already too far behind." Ethan didn't flinch. He wasn't about to let this guy intimidate him. "What's coming next? What's your end game?" The man took another step forward, the rifle still aimed at them, and his smirk deepened. "Our end game, as you call it, isn't something you can stop. It's already happening. You're not as clever as you think. We control the future, and we'll reshape it however we see fit." Before Ethan could respond, the sound of heavy doors opening echoed through the hallway. The man's eyes flicked toward the sound. And in that brief moment of distraction, Ethan acted. He lunged forward, tackling the man to the ground with a strength born out of desperation. The rifle skittered across the floor, its muzzle pointing harmlessly toward the ceiling. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest as he struggled to gain the upper hand. The man fought back fiercely, throwing punches that grazed Ethan's face. But it was no use. The adrenaline coursing through Ethan's veins was enough to fuel him as he managed to pin the man to the floor. "Stay down!" Ethan shouted, pressing his knee into the man's chest. The man grinned, blood staining his teeth. "You can't win. Even if you kill me, you can't stop what's already been set in motion. It's too late for you." Ethan hesitated, his mind torn. Was this it? Could he really stop it by killing this man? No, it wasn't just him. There had to be a bigger plan, a way to unravel the entire operation, and that meant getting to the heart of the organization. But if he let this man go, wouldn't it be a mistake? Wouldn't it mean the death of everyone they had fought for? Just as the man opened his mouth to speak again, a voice cut through the air, sharp, commanding. "Enough." Ethan turned to see Dr. Herrera standing by the control panel, her face as cold as the man's. But there was something different in her eyes, something sharp. "What are you doing?" Ethan demanded. "We have him. We can end this now." Dr. Herrera didn't move. "No, we can't kill him. We need him alive. We need to know everything about the machine, about their plan. Killing him won't stop them." Ethan's breath came fast. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "He's a threat. He's the one who's been controlling everything. And if we kill him, we'll never know how far this goes," Dr. Herrera countered. "This man is just a pawn in a much bigger game. We need to play it smart." Ethan stood up slowly, his eyes locked on the man beneath him. For a moment, all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart. This wasn't just about vengeance. This was bigger than that, but it didn't make the decision any easier. "Fine," Ethan said through gritted teeth. "But if he so much as twitches, I'm finishing it." Dr. Herrera nodded, stepping forward. "We're not finished yet. We need to find their command center, the place where they're really running this operation. You don't just build a time-altering machine and stop there. We need to take the entire system down." Ethan hesitated. "And how do you propose we do that? You saw what happened last time we tried to get close. We're outnumbered." Dr. Herrera's eyes flashed with determination. "There's one more thing we can do. I've been monitoring their communications for months. I've been waiting for them to slip up. I know where their most vulnerable point is. We just have to get to it before they realize we've already infiltrated their facility." Cole, who had been silent up until now, stepped forward. "So we hit them where it hurts. We disrupt their network, take down their command center. We turn the tables." Ethan nodded slowly. "All right, let's do it." Dr. Herrera turned to the man on the ground, her voice calm yet firm. "You have one chance to cooperate. If you do, you'll walk away from this. But if you try to stop us again, I'll make sure you don't leave here alive. Understand?" The man didn't answer, but his eyes told the story. He was beaten, broken for the moment, but he wasn't defeated. Not yet. Dr. Herrera glanced at Ethan. "We don't have much time. Let's move. We have to destroy the core of the operation, and we have to do it before they can reset the machine. It's only a matter of minutes before they're aware of our breach." The plan was set. No more hesitation, no more second-guessing. Together, the three of them moved swiftly through the corridors of the facility. With each step, the weight of what they were about to do pressed on Ethan's shoulders, but there was no turning back now. If they didn't succeed, the entire world would remain under the organization's control. The deeper they went into the heart of the complex, the more they felt the pulse of the machine. Its hum was growing louder, more frantic, as if it were feeding off their presence. The halls seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning, But Dr. Herrera led them without hesitation. She knew this place, and she knew what had to be done. Finally, they reached a large reinforced door. Dr. Herrera quickly punched in the code, and the door slid open with a loud screech. Inside was a massive control center filled with dozens of screens showing real-time data, military assets, and detailed surveillance feeds. In the center of the room was a large console, surrounded by servers that hummed with a low metallic thrum. Ethan's eyes scanned the room. There, at the far end, was a large chamber, sealed off and guarded by a team of operatives. Dr. Herrera's voice was quiet, but intense. That's the core. That's where the machine's control center is. We need to get inside, destroy the network, and initiate the shutdown sequence. We can't afford to hesitate. Ethan's breath hitched. This was it. The final step. The control center was a maze of blinking lights, constant beeps, and the ominous hum of machinery working to rewrite the very fabric of time. Herrera led the way, her every step calculated, as though she had anticipated this moment for years. Ethan and Cole followed closely, their nerves taut like wires, each one of them fully aware of the stakes. The room ahead was their final battleground, the heart of Project Kronos, where everything had been manipulated, twisted, and controlled. The operatives guarding the chamber had noticed their arrival. They were too close to the core now to back down. Gunfire rang out, echoing in the tight corridor. Ethan, Cole, and Dr. Herrera ducked behind a row of servers, the sound of bullets ricocheting off the metal walls. The plan was simple. Reach the core, destroy the network, and initiate the shutdown. They had no time for mistakes. "Go!" Dr. Herrera shouted as she sprinted towards the control panel. The door to the chamber was already open, a cold steel barrier separating them from the heart of the operation. Ethan and Cole covered her as she ran, guns raised, eyes darting from shadow to shadow, trying to predict the next move. Ethan's mind was a blur of urgency, and every muscle in his body screamed at him to move faster. The tension was unbearable. Their time was running out. The machine, the one that had twisted the timeline for years, was still running, its hum growing louder. The sound filled the air, rattling his bones. As they reached the chamber, Dr. Herrera slammed her hands down on the console, her fingers flying over the keys, entering the final sequence. The screens flickered violently, the data running across them moving too fast for Ethan to comprehend. He could feel the weight of their mission pressing down on him. This was it. One wrong move, and everything they had worked for would be erased. But then, a voice. "You're too late." Ethan spun around, gun raised, eyes locking onto the man from earlier, the one who had chased them all this way, the one who believed the organization's grip on the world was unshakable. He stood in the doorway, his face devoid of any fear. Behind him, the remaining operatives were already positioning themselves, ready to take them down. "You think you can destroy it?" the man sneered, stepping forward. "You don't understand. This isn't just about time. It's about control. We control everything. We always have." Ethan's heart raced, but his resolve was stronger now. He didn't hesitate. He fired. The bullet struck the man in the shoulder, but he didn't go down. Instead, the man smiled, his expression almost proud. "You've already lost," the man said as he fell to the ground. "You'll never know what comes next." Dr. Herrera glanced at Ethan for a moment. Her face was resolute, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "It's not over," she said. As the system began to stabilize, the screens stopped flickering, and the hum of the machine began to die down. "The timeline is still shifting. We have to finish it." The final sequence had begun. There was no turning back now. Dr. Herrera hit the last key, and for a moment, everything went dark. Then, the machine powered down. Completely. The silence in the room was suffocating. Ethan, Cole, and Dr. Herrera stood there for a long time, staring at the now quiet control center. The hum was gone, the data streams were still, and the monitors blinked only with static, but something had changed. Ethan could feel it in the air. The weight of the world, the knowledge that they had just undone the manipulation of time itself, settled heavily on his shoulders. For a brief moment, he was tempted to believe that it was over, that they had finally won. But as the silence stretched on, the truth settled in. This was only the beginning. "Is it really over?" Ethan asked, his voice low, uncertain. Dr. Herrera looked up at the darkened room. "For now, but the damage has been done. We can't undo what's been changed, but we've given the world a chance to heal, a chance to be free of this control." Ethan looked at the screens, each one now displaying the same static, the same nothingness. The world would go on, but how? They had exposed the truth, but they hadn't solved the underlying question. How would humanity cope with the possibility that its history had been manipulated for so long? Ethan turned to Dr. Herrera. "You're not going to disappear, are you?" She gave him a faint smile. "I've been hiding long enough. I'll disappear from here, but not from the truth. The world has been altered, but now it's up to them to fix it." Ethan and Cole nodded. There was a weight in the air, one that wasn't just about the loss of the organization, but about what came next. The unknown. The world they had saved was now free from the organization's grip, but how would they rebuild it? How would they make sense of the pieces that had been altered, erased, rewritten? They didn't have the answers, but for the first time, they didn't need them. They had done what they could. As they turned to leave the control room, Ethan couldn't help but feel the weight of the future pressing down on him. The timeline had been set free, but the consequences of that freedom were unknown. And that in itself was both terrifying and exhilarating. The door slid open behind them. As they stepped into the hallway, the faint hum of the facility died behind them, and the world outside awaited, still uncertain, still untamed. For now, they were free. And that was enough.